Across the turning year, peasant food began with grain because grain carried so much of the body's daily strength. In the thinner part of the year, rural eating often settled around cereal pottage, a boiled food that made sense when fuel had to be guarded as closely as stores. Barley, oats, peas, and beans all belonged within that wider world of cereals and pulses, though they did not form one single standard pot. The hearth therefore held a flexible practice rather than a fixed recipe. Bread remained near that same center of subsistence, and the boiling pot gave households a way to draw nourishment from what was common, durable, and divisible. This opening season sets the measure for the journey ahead, not abundance first, but the management of grain, fire, and time. Dairy added another form of keeping. Cheese changed milk from a brief, fresh food into something that could last beyond the milking, giving households a store that answered a different need from the grain bin. Butter and curds also belonged within mixed peasant agriculture, beside bread and pottage, rather than outside them as special luxuries. Their place depended on livestock resources and on a household's share in that mixed economy, so access was uneven. Where animals and dairying fitted the holding, these foods gave variety and fat to a diet still shaped by cereals. Where they did not, bread and boiled grain carried more of the burden. The season of milk and herbs therefore widens the table without overturning it, showing how small stores and living animals both shaped what could be eaten. At harvest, food moved into a more public pattern of work. Feeding laborers was employer provisioning, not a year-round household menu, and it answered the demands of a concentrated season. Bread and ale stood at the center of that provisioning. Their importance also fits the broader dominance of cereal calories, though the harvest pattern should remain tied to its own setting. Cheese could serve there as a durable stored food where it was available, practical because it kept and could be issued alongside the staples of labor. The harvest table was therefore organized around endurance, quantity, and coordination. After that busiest stretch, the year narrowed again toward foods preserved for colder months. Salted stores did not begin a separate world. They carried forward the same discipline of keeping, rationing, and making provisions hold. Spring eating in the countryside carried forward the discipline of the colder months, with cereal pottage doing much of the quiet work. Grain supplied a dominant share of calories, and boiling made that grain serve with particular economy. A pot kept heat gathered in one place, softened hard stores, and demanded less fuel than repeated baking or roasting. In a season when supplies had to last until later growth could matter, that thrift was not a small detail. It shaped the form of the food itself. Barley, oats, peas, and beans all belonged to the broader world of cereals and pulses, though they did not make one standard mixture repeated everywhere. Their importance lay in the range they offered to a plain method. Grain gave body, pulses added substance, and water stretched what remained from store. This was lean food, but not empty food. It had weight because the crops behind it had already survived storage, rent, seed needs, and household use. Spring pottage therefore belonged to a working balance between hunger and fuel, between the grain bin and the fire. It answered a season that was neither winter nor true plenty. The bowl held durability more than freshness, and its plainness came from practical intelligence rather than neglect. This economy made one stored crop serve several needs without claiming that every household ate alike. Spring began with food that could endure pressure, carry calories, and keep a rural household within the limits set by store, fuel, and time. Bread remained central in spring, so the lean season did not reduce grain to the pot alone. The same stored cereals that thickened boiled food also appeared in forms that could be cut, carried, shared, or used to steady thinner accompaniments. Bread gave the table a firmer shape than pottage by itself. It turned grain into something portable and divisible, suited to work, household routine, and the need to make food answer more than one setting. Portability also let bread support work away from the pot, while remaining within household grain use. Boiling and baking placed different demands on fuel and timing, and together they show how carefully grain was handled. Bread required heat gathered for a particular task, while pottage could continue more modestly after the fire had done its main labor. This difference mattered in spring, when fuel and food both had to be managed without waste. Grain therefore occupied more than one texture in rural eating. It could be spooned, broken, soaked, or chewed, but it remained the chief support beneath the meal. Calling spring food lean should not make it sound formless. Its repetition gave it order. Bread beside boiled grain and pulses made a narrow diet more workable, not more abundant. The table still rested on stored crops, but those crops were used with variety inside constraint. In that sense, spring grain was not merely an ingredient, it was the structure that held together the household's food before the year offered easier additions. Garden produce entered spring food unevenly, according to land, region, and household resources. A useful plot, favorable local practice, and available labor could bring small crops into the pot, while another household stayed closer to stored grain and pulses. Greens, roots, or other garden produce might change the taste and texture of boiled food without replacing its foundation. Their value came from addition, not transformation. A few fresh or newly usable foods could make the season feel less severe, yet they remained tied to access. Spring did not distribute its garden help equally across the countryside. Soil, rights, settlement pattern, and the size of a holding all shaped what could be grown and used. Garden access therefore marked differences in land and labor. Even when the added foods remained nutritionally secondary to cereals, the result was quiet variation rather than a single peasant dish. Some tables would have had pottage that stayed plain and store-based. Others could widen it with produce from ground close enough and productive enough to matter. That difference should be kept modest, because small garden foods did not overturn the cereal base. They worked at the edges of it. Their importance was practical, especially when the main food was so repetitive. Freshness in spring was therefore local and measured. It belonged to the household that could reach it, tend it, and bring it into cooking at the right moment. Where it appeared, it softened the lean season while leaving grain and pulses in command. Milk and cheese formed another possible supplement to rural grain, but they too were uneven across households. Their place depended on animals, access, labor, and the management of dairy at a time when every resource had other uses. Where milk was available, it could enrich plain food or stand beside bread. Cheese had the advantage of keeping longer, which made it useful in a diet shaped by storage and careful use. These foods gave fat, flavor, and nourishment, but they did not displace cereals. They widened the meal only where the conditions of the holding allowed them to do so. A household with dairy resources met spring differently from one that relied more tightly on grain, peas, and beans. The contrast was not theatrical. It lay in small margins of sustenance and variety. A little dairy could make repeated foods more satisfying, while its absence kept the table closer to the harder rhythm of stored crops and boiled staples. This was one reason rural spring eating could differ within the same broad pattern. Agriculture was mixed, but its benefits were not evenly shared. Animals, rights, and household capacity all affected what reached the table. Dairy's uneven presence reflected livestock ownership and household capacity rather than a dependable supplement shared across all villages. Milk and cheese, therefore, show the social and practical depth of food that might otherwise seem simple. The spring diet was cereal-based, yet it was never separated from the wider economy of land, stock, and work. Food in manorial life also appeared within organized occasions of labor, obligation, and provision. Such meals belonged to the ordering of work as much as to appetite. They show that eating could be tied to service, payment, custom, and authority. not only to private household need, yet those formal occasions should not be treated as the ordinary family meal. They sat alongside domestic food rather than replacing it. The daily spring table remained shaped by stores, access to small additions, and the resources controlled within or around a holding. This distinction matters because visible provisioning can make rural eating seem more uniform than it was. Organized provisions recorded obligations more clearly than ordinary eating inside homes. Bread, ale, grain, dairy, or other foods issued in a work setting answered a particular social purpose. Household pottage answered another. Both belonged to the same countryside, but they operated at different levels of rural life. Spring food was therefore socially placed as well as practical. The plain bowl was connected to landholding, labor duties, rents, and local hierarchy, even when it remained a domestic food. Its ingredients carried the pressure of those arrangements. Grain stores, garden access, dairy resources, and the obligations around work all shaped what was available and how it was used. The peasant meal was not isolated from lordship, but neither was it identical with the meals that lordship organized. Spring's lean food belonged to both survival and order, held inside the ordinary structures of the village economy. Peasant diets also changed across the generations before and after the Black Death, and spring eating belongs within that larger movement. Labor conditions, wages, land access, and local opportunity altered what rural households could command. A spring table before the great demographic rupture did not necessarily rest on the same margins as one in a later village economy. Chronology changes the margins of this pattern without turning every later household into a necessarily richer one. Still, the season keeps its recognizable structure. Cereal foods came first, pulses belonged within that base, garden produce helped where access allowed, and dairy widened the diet where animals and management made it possible. Broad urban dietary patterns offer only a distant comparison. They average lives across long spans and belong to towns rather than to one rural spring meal. The countryside was more immediate and local in its food pressures, governed by stored crops, household rights, animals, fuel, and the slow turn from winter keeping toward new growth. This first part of spring therefore closes on restraint rather than scarcity alone. Pottage mattered because it made grain and pulses workable with limited fuel. Bread mattered because grain still needed more than one form. Gardens and dairy mattered because they marked the difference between households without changing the basic order. The table remained plain, but it was organized. Its strength lay in foods that could stretch, keep, and combine, carrying rural life through the narrow weeks before the year began to open more fully. Within that order, pottage mattered most as a form of cooking, not as a fixed spring recipe. One vessel made sense in households where fuel was a counted resource and heat had to do several kinds of work at once. Grain and pulses softened together, water carried their substance, and small plant additions entered without multiplying fires, pans, or labor. The method turned stored crops into something warm, filling, and stretchable, while leaving room for local differences. Spring did not offer one named pot for all villages or all holdings. It offered a practical way to carry the cereal base through a lean part of the year. Wild foods and garden crops also belonged to rural food culture, but they fit best as broad categories within ordinary practice. Leaves, roots, herbs, and other plant foods stood beside cultivated plots, common rights, and household stores. They were not a guaranteed flourish for every bowl, nor a recipe with a single rural name. Their importance lay in widening a basic grain preparation when access, timing, and work permitted it. Pottage, therefore, sits at the center of spring not because every household ate the same mixture, but because the form welcomed whatever modest additions belonged within reach. Its economy was built into the pot itself. Fuel, grain, water, and plant foods met in a method suited to pressure. It also kept the cooking task close to the stored crop, not the market. This mattered most under pressure. The result was flexible rather than picturesque, a plain food form capable of absorbing small differences without losing its sober spring character. The cooking place itself was not one repeated medieval arrangement. Peasant kitchens differed in their equipment, and those differences mattered in quiet, practical ways. A bakestone gave grain a flat, heated surface, useful for oatcakes or other simple breads, where local custom and crop choice made that sensible. A cooking vessel drew the same harvest towards simmering, thickening, and softening. Neither implement defines a particular spring meal, yet each points to household material difference. One household economy held more than one workable route from grain to food. Another relied more heavily on boiling and stewing. The contrast was not a neat ladder from misery to comfort. It was a domestic pattern shaped by tools, fuel, crop, and labor. A flat surface required its own handling of heat. A vessel over the hearth made thrift through water and time. Both belonged to ordinary rural management, and both placed limits around what a cook did with the same stored grain. In the lean weeks of spring, such limits carried weight. Food was shaped before taste entered the matter, because the available surface or pot decided how grain met heat. The household with a bakestone did not escape the season's restraint, and the household centered on a vessel did not lose every alternative. Still, equipment gave spring food different textures from one holding to another. Some grain became soft and spooned, some firmer and baked flat. This was domestic capacity, not display or culinary ambition. The larger point is modest but important. Material things helped organize rural eating without turning any implement into one clearly defined ordinary daily supper. Outside the cooking place, mixed peasant agriculture changed the range of possible combinations. A household with field grain and usable garden produce had more scope than one dependent on the field alone. The difference need not have been large to matter. A plot near the dwelling, a strip managed for household plants, or access to small cultivated growth altered the handling of a cereal base. Grain still carried the weight. The garden did not replace the barn, nor did a handful of green food turn spring into abundance. It changed the degree to which the bowl grew thicker, looser, sharper, or more varied, while remaining recognizably a grain food. This is where pottage becomes socially revealing. Its form was common, but its contents answered to uneven resources. Land, labor, rights, tools, and timing all pressed on what joined the pot. A small holding with narrow reserves faced the season differently from a holding with more scope to join field and garden. No universal spring menu covered all rural English households. The countryside shared pressures, not identical meals. That distinction keeps the season from becoming either a single picture of hardship or a cheerful scene of new growth. Spring food was made from what each household controlled and what lay lawfully or practically within reach. The same name for a dish sheltered many degrees of thickness, color, and supplement. The bowl carried that unevenness without announcing it as rank. Such differences were not ornamental. They marked how far a household's agriculture extended beyond the main crop and how much room existed for adjustment before fresh supplies became stronger. Field crops also became drink, placing ale beside pottage as another use of the same rural base. The two were related without being interchangeable. Pottage turned grain toward bulk, warmth, and the filling work of the bowl. Ale turned grain toward drink, nourishment, and the customary place of brewing in everyday life. Their proportions in spring meals were not fixed into one balance. The practical issue was allocation. A household crop served several demands before the season's pressure eased. Food, drink, seed, labor, storage, and obligation all made claims on what had been grown. A pot of pottage used the store in one way, brewing used it in another. This division sharpened the importance of grain because the field reserve had to answer thirst as well as hunger. Rural diets generally included less meat and marine fish than town diets, so urban food remains a contrast rather than a model for the countryside. Towns had stronger ties to markets, craft incomes, and sea fish supply. Villages stayed closer to landholding, crop stores, household production, and local access. That contrast does not make rural eating a failed version of urban eating. It shows why grain foods and grain drink carried such weight in spring. The spring table was governed by a small arithmetic of use. Some grain thickened the pot, some passed through brewing, some had to remain for other duties. Choice, when it appeared, worked inside those obligations, and the grain economy remained both domestic and social before any meal reached the mouth. The balance changed by household, but the pressure behind it stayed recognizably rural. Across a lifetime, diet formed broad bodily patterns rather than a list of dishes eaten on one spring day. Such patterns suit the scale of habit, a strong place for cereals, a rural outline distinct from towns, and long continuities in the foods that carried ordinary labor. They do not turn into the contents of a single bowl. The useful picture remains practical and restrained. One-pot cooking saved fuel and made stored crops workable. Kitchen equipment gave grain different routes into food. Mixed agriculture widened some bowls through garden produce while leaving others close to the field. Ale drew on grain by a different path, and meat or sea fish stood less centrally in rural diets than in urban ones. These points belong together, but they should not be flattened into one peasant supper. Spring's lean pottage was a framework of use. It held crops, fuel, tools, and access in a form that answered pressure. It also carried social difference in quiet ways, because means appeared through thickness, supplement, equipment, and the ability to divide grain among competing needs. By this stage of the season, the rural table remains plain without being empty, varied without becoming free. Its strength lay in managed use, not plenty or display. The old stores still matter, new plant growth has not taken command, and household resources continue to decide how far the basic cereal order can bend. The story of spring, therefore, pauses on disciplined flexibility, a pot able to stretch small supplies, a table shaped by local means, and a season still moving carefully between winter keeping and fuller growth. The season, therefore, stays with the careful arithmetic already in place. Stored grain remains the first support through the lean weeks, and other foods enter only where a household has the means to spare them. A little dairy, a handful of garden growth, beans held back from the previous year, or some other addition belongs to access, not to a general spring plenty. Around the early 14th century, crop-heavy eating could still dominate the lives of rural families, especially where landholding was narrow and the household had few ways to loosen its dependence on the field. The pot takes its meaning from that pressure. It allows small quantities to be joined without turning them into separate dishes, and it keeps the meal close to the store that must also answer for seed, dews, bread, drink, and hunger. This was not emptiness, but it was a disciplined kind of variety. The household with more land, animals, or garden ground could soften the cereal base more often than one held close to a bin and a small patch. Food security made every supplement count. Spring pottage, in this setting, was not a recipe waiting for fresh abundance. It was a way of keeping the known order workable while old stores declined and new growth remained uncertain. The main structure stayed cereal-led, and the differences lay in thickness, additions, and the freedom to use grain without fearing the next demand on it. Resources therefore governed not only which supplements appeared, but how safely a household could divide stored grain among food, seed, dews, and drink through spring. The grain store also stood behind forms of food that did not look like pottage at all. Bread making and brewing belonged to the same cereal economy, so the spring table cannot be divided neatly between bowl, loaf, and drink. Each drew on harvested grain, and each made a different claim on the household reserve. A better supplied holding could keep bread more steadily, brew with less anxiety, and still leave room for a pot strengthened with beans, dairy, or garden produce. A smaller holding made those uses compete more sharply. Grain placed toward a loaf could not also become ale or stretch a pottage. The ordinary meal therefore carried a practical calculation inside it. Household resources and landholding shaped how much bread, ale, dairy, and garden produce a family could secure, and that shape appeared in plain routines rather than in display. A farm with enough land might make the relation among loaf, drink, and pot seem settled, while a poorer one felt the strain among them. Pottage mattered because it was flexible, but its flexibility never escaped the amount of grain already held. It could receive a modest addition, thicken a thin day, or make mixed stores useful, yet it remained bound to the same harvest base as baking and brewing. Spring food, then, was not one humble dish set apart from the rest of the household economy. It was one part of a larger grain discipline, where every form of provision drew strength from the same stored crop and revealed how much room the household possessed. Those competing uses kept cereal choice consequential. Fuller rural feeding belonged to another setting when food was issued for labor, obligation, or a marked occasion. A manor could provide bread, ale, and accompaniments to workers in ways shaped by service and management, not by the daily pattern of a small household. Harvest feeding, task provisions, and formal distributions belonged to organized work as much as to appetite. They placed food within the order of lordship, labor, and seasonal duty. That matters because such meals should not be turned into ordinary domestic menus. A household cooking from its own store faced a different pressure from an estate arranging food for a group at work. The same grain, drink, or side food could appear in both worlds, but the meaning changed. Bread and ale supplied for a task carried the structure of obligation. Bread and ale kept at home carried the pressure of the family store. Spring pottage belongs chiefly to that quieter domestic frame, where limited resources were managed day after day and additions depended on what the household could command for itself. The contrast keeps the rural table from becoming too generous by mistake. Organized feeding shows that the countryside could produce fuller moments, but those moments were not the measure of common spring eating. In the household, the lean bowl remained closer to land, stores, and immediate need. Its importance lay in ordinary control, turning what was available into a meal without assuming that festive, collective, or work-related provision reflected the usual reach of every rural home. Occupational provision could be fuller because it answered bounded work rather than household eating. The balance of spring food also changed across time. After the Black Death, food patterns diversified in some places, so spring consumption changed with chronology and local conditions. Population loss, shifts in labor value, changes in tenure, and altered access to land affected the ways rural people obtained food. A later 14th century household did not simply repeat the same spring balance known before the plague. Some families gained more room around the cereal base. Others stayed close to older limits through local circumstance, obligation, or poverty. The pot remained familiar because grains still organized rural eating, but the conditions around that pot could move. A plain bowl before the plague might belong to tight landholding and heavy dependence on crops. A similar bowl later might stand within a household that had more chance of reaching dairy, garden produce, or better drink. The form endured while its social surroundings shifted. Spring therefore carries chronology as well as thrift. It belongs to the yearly interval between old stores and fuller growth, but it also belongs to a countryside changed by death, bargaining, labor, and opportunity. The cereal base did not disappear, and pottage did not lose its usefulness. What changed was the amount of freedom some households had around it. In one place, extra foods became easier to secure. In another, scarcity held its shape. The lean pot marks that uneven movement. It holds continuity in the method of cooking and alteration in the means that could thicken, accompany, or relieve it. Change remained uneven, since demographic upheaval did not improve access in locality or social position. Place divided spring as clearly as date did. Regional farming variation meant that the same season did not deliver the same table everywhere in England. Soil, livestock, field systems, garden access, and local husbandry shaped what could be added to the cereal base. One district might give more room to milk, greens, or garden growth, while another stayed closer to bread, ale, beans, and thin-grain dishes. The diets of high-ranking households are poor guides to ordinary spring peasant meals because rank widened the table through resources that small holdings did not share. The rural poor were not living inside a single English menu. Their food followed the land, animals, tenures, and household means around them. This keeps pottage local rather than national. It names a useful form of cooking, not a fixed mixture repeated from village to village. In one place it could carry more green matter, in another it remained mainly cereal, in another the supplement depended on dairy access or a small productive plot. The shared feature was controlled use before the year opened fully, not sameness of contents. By the close of this part of spring, the table remains plain, variable, and socially marked. Stored grain still sets the base. Bread and ale still draw from the same rural economy. Supplements still reveal land, region, and household strength. The lean pot therefore closes as an old and practical form, holding different families at different distances from need while the season moves on. Local conditions shaped supplements, while status determined how far a household could move beyond its cereal foundation in spring. Spring in the countryside was rarely a season of abundance, and its food began with restraint. Meat and fish could appear, yet access depended on status, place, season, and supply. A household closer to water or to better exchange could meet spring differently from one farther inland or tied more tightly to scant local resources. Rural people generally had less meat and marine fish than townspeople, so the city makes a useful contrast, though only a limited one. Town life moved through markets, wages, and buying power that did not simply copy village practice. Even so, the comparison keeps the rural table in view as something defined by narrower options, not by uniform want. In many places, the season still opened on cereals, beans, greens, and stored or locally obtained additions, with animal food appearing less reliably and less evenly. That unevenness mattered because spring was not one rural condition shared in the same way by every family. Some households had better access to supplements, while others remained much closer to a grain base. The difference did not always produce drama, but it shaped the feel of the season and the range of what could be set down. Spring therefore belongs to a countryside of graded access, where the same season touched different homes with different force, and where lean pottage stood as a common answer to a narrow and uneven food supply. Even the weakest table could still be shaped by place, by standing, and by how much the year allowed a household to draw forward from local means. Bread gave spring its quiet hierarchy. Even in a cereal-dependent season, the loaf could mark status, because finer flour, better sifting, and access to better grain made a different table from the rougher bread that ordinary households often relied on. Spring food was not only about whether meat appeared, it was also about the grain itself and about how much care had gone into preparing it. A whiter loaf, a cleaner grind, or a more carefully made batch signaled a stronger hold on grain and milling access, while darker bread pointed toward a narrower margin. That distinction could sit beside a pottage without needing any display or extravagance. Bread remained central enough that its quality carried social meaning on its own. The same season could therefore contain households eating from the same broad cereal world while still sorting them by comfort and rank. Milling rights, lordly control, stored grain, and household reserves all fed into the final loaf, so the line between lean and less lean was not drawn only by quantity. It was drawn by texture, color, and the kind of grain available to be turned into food. A village might appear unified by bread and pottage, yet the bread itself could divide the village in practice. Spring, then, was not simply a matter of bread, it was also a matter of what sort of bread could be brought to the table, and that difference quietly placed households in relation to one another even when their foods looked broadly alike. In that setting, the loaf spoke for the household before any richer dish entered the season. Around 1300, household landholding shaped food security in a very direct way. It did not only determine how much grain could be grown or stored, it also affected whether spring diet could be widened with small supplements from stock, rights, exchange, or occasional purchase. That meant neighboring families might face the same weather and the same season while eating rather differently. One plot could support a more secure table, while another left a household closer to the edge, with fewer extras to break up the cereal base. This matters because spring is often imagined as a shared lean time, yet within a village it could sort people by how much flexibility their holdings allowed. The difference was not always dramatic. It might show up in a modest piece of animal food, a little dairy, or a more reliable run of bread grain, rather than in a feast or a sharp edge of want. Still, the gap was meaningful. A family with stronger land access could absorb the season with less strain, while a poorer neighbor depended more heavily on what could be stretched, borrowed, or supplemented. Spring food, then, was never just about the calendar. It was also about property, rights, and the practical reach of a household's fields and connections. A pair of households could farm the same manor, yet end spring with different reserves, because land holding translated unevenly into milk, eggs, or meat when those things were available. In a village where people lived side by side, the land beneath one roof could translate into a wider range of meals than the land beneath the next roof. Spring food also followed work. Seasonal labor arrangements tied nourishment to service, offering food support for tasks that had to be carried through the busiest stretches of the year. That made the spring table less a fixed household pattern than part of the machinery of rural obligation. The food attached to work was practical and limited in scope. It supported labor, rewarded duty, and kept people moving through demanding days, but it did not amount to a full yearly menu. Some people received such support because they were drawn into seasonal labor, others remained outside those arrangements and relied on different means. The result was a patchwork of access rather than a single shared table. Spring mattered here because it was both lean and busy. As fields demanded attention, food could be linked to the kind of work being done, and that link showed how eating and obligation overlapped without becoming the same thing. A ration for labor did not define a whole diet, yet it did reveal that nourishment could arrive through service as well as through household store or local exchange. That practical connection helped stretch the season, but it also marked difference because the support went to some people and not to others. In rural life, then, food was never only a private matter of appetite. It could move through duty, rank, and the needs of the manor, with spring labor making the relationship especially visible. What emerged was not a universal peasant menu, but a network of support shaped by the pressures of work and the obligations that came with it for many households. Spring food is clearest when kept close to place, standing, and date. A district, a village, or even a single household could show a different balance of grain and supplement, so the season should not be treated as one uniform rural rule. That local view makes room for the real variety of the countryside without turning it into a blur. In one community, animal food might appear more often. In another, bread and pottage might remain the steady center of the table. In another, the narrowness of the season could fall harder still. The important point is not a single national pattern, but the layered shape of rural life as spring unfolded. Social rank mattered, land holding mattered, and the passage of time mattered too. The spring table, therefore, belonged to a changing landscape of access in practice. Some households stood with a little more room to maneuver, while others moved closer to the edge of a cereal base. Even within a shared manor or parish, the route from grain store to meal could vary enough to make spring feel unequal from one roof to the next. That is where lean pottage belongs, not as a universal rule laid over the countryside, but as a frequent answer to the combination of season, standing, and local provision. Spring ends most truthfully when it is left as a set of connected but uneven tables, each shaped by what could be carried forward from the land, the household, and the year itself. From that unevenness, the season can give way to what comes next without ever becoming the same everywhere. That unevenness belonged first to the way grain moved before it ever reached a hearth. Cereal was not simply waiting in the field until hunger called for it. It was counted as rent, claimed as tithe, gathered into barns, and held in stores before any portion became bread or thickened a pot. The rural meal therefore rested on managed supply as well as on the size of the harvest itself. Spring made that order especially plain because the visible green of the year had not yet become a dependable food base. The standing feature behind the table was the store, with its measured contents and its obligations already attached. Grain had to pass through keeping, milling, and household decision before it entered the daily rhythm of eating. Bread might carry one part of that stored order, while pottage carried another, each drawing on cereals that had survived the colder months. The lean bowl was not separate from the loaf. Both belonged to the same chain of reservation and release. In that chain, a household's spring food was tied to what had been protected from waste, paid out to others, or retained for use. The season was sober because the grain supply had several masters before appetite had its turn. That made the built storehouse part of the meal, even when no one at the table thought of it that way. A pot looked plain and still carried the weight of barns, dues, and careful household arithmetic. Its value lay in making stored cereal last without pretending that storage alone fully removed the pressure of the season. Dairy entered that pressure in a different form. Fresh milk was brief, tied to animals, weather, and daily handling, but cheese remained useful after milk itself was gone. That made processed dairy a reserve, not merely a fresh comfort added to the edge of a meal. Its place in spring depended on access, because a household needed animals, pasture rights, or exchange to draw steadily on milk in the first place. Where landholding was broader or livestock more secure, cereals could be joined with dairy and garden produce in ways that gave the table more room. Poorer neighbors still lived within the same agricultural world, but the combinations available to them were narrower and more fragile. Cheese strengthened a cereal meal, garden foods added another small layer, and together they gave a practical widening of choice rather than display. This is where social difference entered quietly. More land did not turn spring into ease, yet it softened the strain by allowing several food sources to meet. Less land left the cereal base doing heavier work. The contrast was not only between rich and poor households, but between different degrees of slack inside the same season. A small holding, a few animals, a patch of garden ground, and rights in the surrounding landscape altered the shape of spring food. The village table was therefore uneven in its reserves as well as in its harvests. Cheese shows that point clearly because it changed perishable milk into something that waited, and waiting mattered greatly in a lean time. It turned animal keeping into stored patience for the lean spring. Beyond the household, food also appeared in the ordered life of lordship. On estates, provisions were issued with work service, and formal obligation, so eating sometimes belonged to a public arrangement rather than a private pot. That setting gave food a different meaning. Portions handed out for labor, meals attached to service, or supplies connected with office and rank spoke about who owed what, who received what, and where each person stood in the manor's order. Such arrangements do not make a lordly provision the same thing as ordinary eating at home. They show food moving through duty as well as hunger. A serving of grain, bread, ale, or other fare in that world marked labor performed, hospitality expected, or status acknowledged. The household bowl remained quieter, governed by stores, access, and need. The issued portion belonged to a more formal economy of work and recognition. The distinction matters because spring scarcity did not erase social meaning, it sharpened it. Food was ordinary in substance and still carried rank when distributed under authority. Named portions and displayed plenty tell most about duties and standing, while the domestic meal followed the less ceremonial business of keeping people fed. Spring pottage belongs beside those arrangements, not inside them, as though all eating were one thing. The same countryside held a work provision on one side and a home pot on the other, each drawing from familiar foodstuffs, each shaped by a different rule. In that difference, the season becomes social as well as agricultural, and the humble grain base takes on more than one place in village life. The later medieval countryside was also in steady, uneven motion. After the Black Death, diet changed enough that the food of later generations should not be treated as a copy of an earlier age. Population loss, altered labor conditions, and changing tenures affected what many rural households obtained, even where old habits of bread, grain, dairy, and garden produce continued. The pot did not lose its place, but the world around the pot shifted. In some districts, survivors gained more access to land or animal foods. In others, custom, poverty, or local pressure kept choices tighter. The change was uneven, yet it was real enough to keep spring eating from becoming a fixed picture. Region mattered too. England's farming patterns differed from one area to another, and those differences shaped seasonal possibility. Pastoral districts, arable villages, mixed regions, and places with particular garden or stock resources did not face spring with identical supplies. A cereal dish in one area sat beside more dairy, another leaned more heavily on grain, pulses, or the produce of small plots. These differences did not remove the lean character of spring, but they changed how that leanness was managed. A later medieval spring meal therefore belonged to date and place together. It carried older structures of storage and obligation, while also reflecting shifts in labor, land, and regional farming. The countryside was recognizable across generations, but not motionless. Its foodways held continuity in the pot and bread basket while adapting to altered circumstances around them, especially where work, holdings, and local husbandry had been gradually rearranged over the following decades. The plant side of that world leaves a final kind of outline. Sturdy grains, pulses, weed seeds, and other preserved plant traces point toward crops, gardens, and farming choices behind rural diet. The durable pieces favor some foods over others. Cereals and seeds lasted where soft leaves, cooked mixtures, dairy foods, and many everyday scraps vanished. So the rural table is clearest in its staples, its cultivation, and its keeping, rather than in a full set of household dishes. That unevenness keeps the spring table varied without turning every plant into daily food. That suits spring, which is best understood through patterns rather than a single bowl named for every household. Stored cereal, preserved dairy, small garden produce, and local access all belonged to the season, but no one arrangement speaks for the whole countryside. Spring food, in that narrower and stronger pattern, drew on what was kept, owed, issued, exchanged, or grown early enough to matter, and those possibilities were locally divided by household standing, region, and historical moment. Pottage sits within that frame as a common answer to pressure, not as the whole of peasant eating. It gathered some of the season's limits into an edible form while leaving room for difference around it. By the close of this part of the journey, the lean bowl has done its work as a marker of managed survival. It points backward to barns, dews, cheese, gardens, labor, and local farming, then releases the season without making every village, holding, or generation the same. Its quiet importance lies in proportion, not in turning one food into the whole story. At spring's close, pottage remains best understood as a way of cooking under pressure, not as a single named dish. Boiling suited rural kitchens where fuel had to be guarded because one vessel softened grain, carried liquid, and accepted small additions without demanding a separate fire for every part of the meal. That economy of heat helps explain the strength of pottage across peasant foodways. It worked with barley, oats, rye, pulses, greens, and whatever modest thickening the household had available, while still leaving the result recognizably ordinary. The point was not delicacy, the point was managed usefulness. Roasting required stronger fuel and better portions. Baking belonged to ovens, dough, timing, and available meal. Boiling answered a different daily problem, turning limited stores into something warm, filling, and shareable. It also allowed ingredients to change without making the method fail. A thinner mixture still fed, a thicker one stretched the remaining grain. Small garden or dairy additions altered the bowl without changing its place in the meal. The method was repeated with little alteration from day to day, which made it valuable where supply changed faster than custom. That flexibility is why spring pottage carries so much meaning at the end of this first season. It shows neither pure misery nor rustic abundance. It shows a practical form shaped by fuel, storage, and household standing, able to gather the season's pressures without making every rural table the same. In that sense, the bowl closes spring as an answer to scarcity, but a disciplined one made from habit as much as need and without much special ceremony. The grain behind that pot reached far beyond pottage. A cereal harvest shaped bread and ale together because the same field system supplied both baking and brewing. When grain stores held, the household's food and drink had a steadier base. When they tightened, the pressure touched loaf, mash, and pot at once. Medieval rural eating was therefore not divided into one story for meals and another for drink. Grain passed through different forms, each with its own labor and timing, yet all depended on the same harvest cycle. Cutting, threshing, drying, grinding, malting, measuring, owing, and keeping formed the quiet background to spring. By the time the season was nearing its end, the household was living with the consequences of an earlier crop and the demands still placed upon it. Bread remained a chief expression of cereal strength. Ale made the same dependence drinkable. Pottage turned it into a cooked mixture that absorbed shortage with fewer demands. None of those forms erased the others. Together they show how deeply the countryside's ordinary fare rested on grain before any garnish, supplement, or festive issue entered the picture. This made the harvest a food event and a drink event together, not two separate reckonings divided between kitchen and brewhouse. Social standing, region, rents, labor duties, and access to mills or ovens changed how that base was handled. The broad dependence still remained at the table and in storage. Spring's lean food therefore belongs inside a larger cereal economy, where solid food and everyday drink rose from one agricultural foundation and felt the same strain when that foundation narrowed. Around that cereal base, smaller plant foods changed the texture of spring without overturning its order. Garden produce mattered where households had the ground, tools, time, and rights to use it. Leaves, roots, herbs, and early cultivated growth added sharpness, softness, bulk, or freshness to food that otherwise leaned heavily on stored grain. They did not replace bread or pottage, and they did not make spring secure by themselves. Their value lay in tempering dependence. A household with garden access made grain carry more variety. One without it faced a narrower range. Beyond cultivated plots, the countryside offered further possibilities where custom, location, and season allowed them. Wild foods and orchard crops widened the rural food landscape past the fields of cereal grain. Nuts, berries, fruits, leaves, and tree produce belonged to a broader pattern of local use, though unevenly by place and status. This widening matters because peasant food was not only what was counted from the main arable fields, it was also shaped by edges, enclosures, gardens, rights of use, and the land around a settlement. By late spring, such foods had done quiet work as additions and variations. They softened sameness, gave the pot a different balance, and made some tables less dependent on grain alone. Their presence kept rural food tied to locality because the same season did not offer the same plant world everywhere, yet they remained supplements inside a grain-led world. The season's rural diet becomes clearer when that distinction holds. Field cereal at the center, garden and gathered foods around it, each important without being made larger than its place. Animal foods and labor meals require another careful kind of proportion here. Meat appeared in rural life, but its presence does not turn the household pot into a daily meat stew. Access to animals, slaughter, preserved meat, and market exchange varied widely, and the fact of access belongs to a broader food world rather than to one exact spring dish. Long-run diet also tells a slower story than the end of a single season. Over months and years, eating habits formed broad bodily patterns from grain, drink, plants, dairy, and animal foods, but those patterns are not the same as naming one meal in one household. They show a durable balance of nourishment, not the contents of one pot on a particular spring day. That distinction keeps spring pottage attached to broad habit rather than one fixed supper. Provisioning for heavy labor adds a social boundary as well. When employers fed workers during harvest, the food issued belonged to that organized setting of work, obligation, and payment in kind. It was real food, and it was sometimes substantial, but it was not simply the household's ordinary fare repeated under another roof. The demands of harvest made feeding visible because labor had to be sustained, managed, and rewarded. Spring stands before that fuller moment, yet the connection is already present. Rural food moved through households, lordship, work customs, and seasonal obligations, and each setting gave food a different meaning. The lean pot at spring's end therefore remains important without becoming the measure of every food a peasant encountered, owed, prepared, or ate within the wider countryside. The season finally closes within the order of the fields themselves. Crop rotation and seasonal sowing shaped work, expectation, and supply across the countryside, setting the frame in which grain was renewed or withheld. Those practices organized labor over time, but they did not translate directly into a named household dish at spring's end. Sown ground, fallow ground, stored grain, and early growth all belonged to the same agricultural rhythm, while the food indoors came from what had been kept, owed, exchanged, grown early, gathered, or spared. Spring was therefore not an empty pause before better eating. It was a working interval between harvests, bound to past storage and future uncertainty. The pot stood inside that interval. It drew on the cereal base, accepted garden and gathered additions where access allowed, reflected the cost of fuel, and sat beside bread and ale as another form of the same rural foundation. Field planning mattered from season to season because it arranged labor and hope, while household food still depended on what actually remained available. Its place is as important as its reach. It does not contain the whole peasant diet, the whole village economy, or the whole year. It marks one durable way of making food from a world organized by land, labor, season, and status. By leaving spring here, the story keeps the bowl in proportion. Pottage has carried restraint, resourcefulness, and local difference far enough. The countryside now turns toward another set of foods and practices, while the older cycle remains underneath, measuring survival through keeping, sowing, working, and waiting for growth to become nourishment. Summer can enter the food story through milk without turning milk into a food of one fixed season. Medieval households knew milk as part of diet, yet its place did not follow one calendar for every village or holding. What mattered first was the range of dairy itself. Fresh milk, cheese, butter, and curds were separate foods, each with its own handling and purpose, not interchangeable signs that fresh milk was always being drunk. Fresh milk belonged closest to the moment of milking, while other dairy forms carried different textures and different demands. This distinction keeps the summer table from becoming too simple. A household with access to dairy did not meet one substance in 4 names. It met several foods that were used in different ways beside the standing grain base. The season gives this part of the year a warmer edge because growth and animal yield widened the table, but that widening never followed a single rule. Milk was near at hand in one place, less present in another, and altered quickly where keeping mattered. The countryside therefore approached dairy as part of a mixed food economy, not as a replacement for the bread and boiled grain that still carried daily eating. Summer begins here with that practical orientation. Animals added to the table, but the table remained governed by the relation between field, household, and store. This keeps the season grounded in use, not in one menu for every summer day. The foods, not the date, carried the historical weight. The clearest built expression of that relation was the making and keeping of cheese. Cheese changed milk from a short-lived liquid into a firmer food that remained useful after the milking moment had passed. That transformation mattered because rural provisioning depended on foods that were held, moved, divided, and returned to later. A dairy space, a press, a shelf, a cloth, or a cool corner did not make abundance by itself, but such arrangements helped turn animal yield into a store. Cheese belonged to that quieter architecture of keeping. It was kept apart from the immediate demands of fresh milk and drawn into eating when grain foods needed company or substance. Its value lay in endurance more than display. By lasting longer, it allowed dairy to travel across the household rhythm in a form less fragile than liquid milk. This did not make cheese a grand food, and it did not free the table from the limits of land or labor. It simply gave milk a second life within the store. The work of keeping also marked a household boundary between quick use and later need. In a rural economy where food had to survive uneven intervals between production and use, that second life was important. Cheese made animal yield available beyond the brief freshness of milk, carrying dairy into the same practical world as grain stores, household vessels, and the managed keeping of ordinary food. Keeping gave ordinary dairy a patience that fresh milk did not have. The practical consequence was a table built by addition. Butter and curds belonged to mixed peasant agriculture, where animals and crops worked through the same household economy. They appeared beside bread and pottage, not over them. Bread, porridge, and thickened grain dishes still gave ordinary eating its weight, while butter enriched a plain food and curds offered a softer dairy form alongside the familiar bowl or loaf. Dairy usually supplemented grain rather than replacing it, and that pattern best defines its role. Small animal products altered the feel and strength of foods already centered on cereals. Their value lay in joining that base rather than becoming the main daily support itself. Butter, curds, and cheese each answered a different practical need, from richness to softness to keeping. Their usefulness came from fitting into meals that were already organized around grain, labor, and household supply. In that sense, dairy added layers rather than a new foundation. It made some meals more sustaining, widened texture, and gave animal keeping a place in daily food without changing the basic order of eating. This is why the peasant dairy world belongs beside the bread oven and the boiling pot, not in a separate story of plenty. Its strength was modest, and its power rested in how well it joined what the fields already provided. The meal gained variety while remaining recognizably cereal-led. That gain was practical rather than ceremonial, the sort of improvement that made repeated grain foods less bare in use. A different feature shaped all of this before food reached the bowl: the uneven possession of animals and the means to use them. Dairy access depended on livestock, household resources, labor, and equipment, so it varied from place to place. A holding with cows or other milk animals, enough hands, and workable storage stood in a different position from one with fewer animals or thinner means. The difference was structural. It followed the size and character of the holding, the balance of land and stock, and the household's ability to process what animals yielded. This made dairy a local matter as much as a dietary category. One community knew cheese more regularly, another curds or butter more sparingly, and another only limited fresh milk. These differences did not need to be dramatic to matter. A small shift in livestock or labor changed what dairy forms appeared often, what had to be saved, and what remained occasional. The peasant table therefore varied too much for one settled rural menu. It reflected the resources standing behind it, including the animals that had to be fed, managed, and milked. Dairy shows the close fit between food and holding. Where resources allowed, it became a useful support to grain. Where they did not, it remained thinner, less regular, and more dependent on circumstance, still understood as food, but not equally present in every household. Such unevenness belonged to the structure of rural life, so dairy marked capacity before it marked taste or preference. Dairy also carried social meaning in the way it appeared beyond the private household. Milk dishes and dairy foods belonged to work meals connected with manorial labor, where eating was tied to obligation, service, and shared provisioning. Such meals marked occasions more clearly than the quiet routine of daily food. They showed dairy entering the world of laboring people in a setting where food was given, expected, or organized around work. But they do not turn that setting into the pattern of every day. A work meal made milk or cheese visible because the occasion itself gathered people and food under a recognized order. That social frame mattered. Eating was never only a matter of filling a stomach. It also carried judgments about propriety, strength, rank, health, and suitability. Attitudes toward milk and cheese varied across medieval contexts, so the same broad category of dairy did not always carry one meaning. In some settings it sat comfortably among useful foods, while in others it drew more careful judgment. For peasants, these meanings did not erase material need. Dairy still fed bodies, supported labor, and joined bread, pottage, and stored food when available. Yet its place in work meals and household talk shows that food moved through custom as well as hunger. Milk and cheese were practical, ordinary, and evaluated all at once, shaped by local habit as surely as by animals and land. Their social place was modest, but not empty. That modest status still gave dairy real presence. By this point in summer, the table has widened without becoming rich or uniform. The important pattern is management, not display. A mixed holding drew value from animals in more than one form, then fitted that value around bread, boiled grain, stores, labor, and local custom. Stronger resources made that fitting easier, while thinner resources narrowed it. The countryside, therefore, had a broken, uneven texture, but not a confused one. Each food carried a job, and each job depended on the practical setting that made it possible. In summer, use mattered more than any single feast or recipe. The season did not set one dairy custom above all others, and it did not turn animal yield into the center of rural eating. It allowed attention to settle on a quieter part of peasant provision, the way small products from livestock entered a grain-led world and stayed there on modest terms. From there, the rural year continues without a sharp break. The household still lives inside fields, animals, stores, and obligations, carrying forward a table whose variety remained measured by the resources that made it. Nothing in that movement stands outside work. The movement is plain rather than dramatic. Food changes form, resources shift their pressure, and the household keeps balancing what animals yield against what fields and stores demand. Summer leaves no single dish behind as its emblem. It leaves instead a modest pattern of careful use. The same economy continues quietly into whatever the season asks next. That same economy made summer's small green foods useful without making them grand. Garden produce could add variety to meals that still leaned on cereals, especially when leaves, onions, leeks, beans, peas, and herbs gave familiar preparations another edge. These additions did not overturn the order of eating. They worked by degrees, adding sharpness, body, freshness, or a little extra substance around the foods that already carried most of the burden. Rural cooking drew on bread, meat, dairy, and garden foods, but not in one standard recipe. The parts shifted according to holding, season, custom, and the resources already tied up in work. One place might bring more herbs into use, another more beans, another only the plainest greens. The value lay in the way modest plants changed repetition without pretending to end it. Summer growth widened the household's range of handling and taste, but it did so inside a food world still governed by fields, stores, animals, and obligation. The garden did not need to produce abundance in order to matter. A few useful crops, close to the dwelling, could make ordinary food less bare, while leaving its structure intact. The table remained measured, practical, and uneven, yet it was not empty of variation. In that restrained sense, herbs and garden crops gave summer a language of small changes, fitted into the same rural economy that had already shaped milk, grain, and household provision. Their scale also kept them supplementary to grain, rather than a replacement. The clearest built feature behind that small change was the working garden itself. It was not a decorative space separated from provision, but a close, usable piece of ground whose worth came from nearness and repeated tending. Its size, soil, manure, drainage, and the time left after heavier labor all shaped what it produced. Regional farming variation shaped what households could grow and eat, because one district offered better garden ground, another stronger pasture, another thinner soils, or harsher conditions for the same crop. The garden, therefore, belonged to the wider farming pattern, rather than standing outside it. Its plants were small beside field grain, yet their place near the home gave them a particular usefulness. Herbs served seasoning, greens gave body, legumes added substance when the plot and season allowed. A small holding did not have to copy a larger one in order to make use of such growth. The practical point was conversion. A narrow strip, a patch of worked soil, or a better supplied plot turned attention and labor into food that entered daily routine. The garden's nearness also made it responsive. It sat between field and kitchen, drawing on the same rural pressures of weather, care, and access. In summer, that feature mattered because fresh plants were not distant luxuries. They were products of small ground under household management, brought into use according to what the place and the people attached to it could support. Plots eased carrying without guaranteeing equal access across households. The practical consequence was a table built by capacity rather than by pattern. Households with more land or livestock had more room to combine garden produce and dairy, because animals, pasture, feed, vessels, storage, and workable ground all affected what could be brought together. Milk, curds, cheese, butter, herbs, greens, beans, and bread did not need to form a fixed order to be meaningful. Their importance lay in how far a household could draw on several modest resources at once. More means did not turn peasant food into refinement. It widened choices around a simple base. Less means narrowed them. Without animals, the dairy side was thinner. Without a useful plot, fresh plants were fewer. Without both, the weight of ordinary eating fell more heavily on stored and field foods. This unevenness gave summer provision a social shape as well as a seasonal one. The same months offered broader combinations in one holding and tighter ones in another, not because appetites differed greatly, but because access did. Garden herbs and dairy belonged to chains of work before they belonged to the bowl or board. Each depended on land, rights, labor, and household equipment. Their meeting was therefore never just a pleasant sign of plenty. It marked a household's practical reach. Some could layer foods in quiet, modest ways. Others relied on one addition at a time. Summer variety, seen from that angle, was not a menu, but a measure of usable resources. Differences followed resources, not culinary preference. A different feature widened the food landscape beyond the garden plot. Wild foods and orchard crops also belonged to the food landscape where peasant households could access them. Trees, field edges, commons, hedgerows, and uncultivated growth added another set of possibilities to rural provision. Apples, pears, nuts, berries, greens, and other gathered foods entered local practice according to rights, custom, abundance, and labor. They were not simply luxuries, and they were not only reserves for distress. When reachable, they added taste, bulk, or seasonal change to the same practical world that held herbs, dairy, and grain. Their place depended on permission and proximity as much as on growth itself. A district with managed fruit trees differed from one with stronger access to greens or nuts, and both differed from places where such foods had little practical reach. The countryside was therefore layered. Worked gardens, animal products, stored crops, field margins, and shared spaces all belonged to its food possibilities, though in unequal ways. These foods did not replace the planted garden or the larger crops. They broadened the routes by which summer freshness entered use. The effect was local, not universal. It rested on the arrangement of land and custom around each community. That made orchard and gathered foods socially revealing as well as practical. What could be picked, claimed, or used marked a household's place within local rules, just as surely as animals and garden ground marked its means. Customary rights could therefore widen or narrow access. The social consequence becomes clearer when towns are held beside the countryside without making them the model. In a port city such as Ostia, herbs, fruits, greens, cereals, and other plants passed through crowded quarters shaped by markets, storage, cooking, craftwork, refuse, drains, and dense settlement. Such urban plant remains show the breadth of foods moving through a city, but they do not turn city habits into a rural household template. The roots were different. Town food passed through purchase, trade, storage, and disposal in ways unlike a peasant holding with its fields, animals, rights, and garden ground. The comparison broadens the view of plant foods while preserving the difference between urban and rural life. It also keeps herbs, fruits, and greens from seeming trivial merely because they were often small additions. In both settings they had practical value, yet their path into use was shaped by place. Preserved plant remains can inform farming as well as diet, so crop material does not automatically prove direct consumption. A plant present in the working world might belong to cultivation, storage, fodder, processing, waste, or food. For summer milk and herbs, that distinction matters because production and eating were closely joined but never identical. What was grown, gathered, carried, or stored created openings. Household use gave those openings their social meaning according to access, labor, custom, and the resources already present. Urban deposits combine many activities, so their contents cannot be read as a household meal or list of consumption. Behind all of this stood the agricultural order that made summer provision possible. Seasonal sowing, crop rotation, and local conditions shaped agricultural supply without directly proving household eating patterns. They set the field rhythm, affected what was available, and limited the mixtures that households could make. Soil, drainage, pasture, garden ground, rainfall, and custom did not dictate one supper or one village style, but they formed the working boundaries within which food was assembled. A place with stronger pasture supported animal products more readily. A place with better small plots made herbs and vegetables more dependable. A district with fruit trees or accessible margins added another layer to use. These variations left the countryside patterned rather than uniform. Summer milk and garden herbs belong inside that pattern, at the meeting point of animal keeping, small cultivation, local rights, and household means. Their importance is quiet because they changed food by adjustment. Fresh growth added flavor and bulk. Dairy added richness and another form of stored or fresh value. Orchard and gathered foods extended the surroundings of the table, yet every addition passed through access, labor, land, and custom before it became ordinary provision. As this part of summer closes, the food world remains simple but not blank. It carries the shape of its place, grain beneath the season's smaller products, animals beside worked plots, and a modest variety made from what each household could actually bring together. Agricultural structure created possibilities without fixing their exact use at table. Summer's earlier greens and dairy do not carry this part of the journey away from grain. Bread, pottage, and ale remained tied together in peasant food culture because cereals still carried the calorie load, even when milk softened a dish or herbs sharpened its taste. The loaf, the pot, and the cup belonged to one broad field economy, not three separate worlds. Grain moved into bread through grinding, into pottage through boiling or thickening, and into ale through malting, so each form drew on the same foundation before it reached table or vessel. This gave summer food a quiet tension. Fresh growth made the season feel wider, and milk gave some households another way to enrich what was already there. But the weight of provision still rested on cereal stores. A meal became greener than it had been in spring, and richer where animals and household means allowed. Yet those changes worked around the foods that supplied most of the strength for work. The season therefore begins here, with continuity rather than release. Grain held the base under the new flavors. Garden herbs, milk, and small vegetables altered texture and taste, but they did not turn peasant eating into a separate summer cuisine. What mattered first was whether grain had been secured in forms able to keep people fed, and whether the household had enough room within that base to welcome additions. This is the point from which the season's grain story quietly takes its practical shape in ordinary rural life. The most visible frame for that dependence was not the garden edge, but the place where grain was claimed, measured, and kept. Tithes and renders took portions of the crop into the obligations of parish, lordship, and tenure, while barns and storage rooms held grain against the long stretch between cutting and eating. Bread owed its central place to this organized passage. It stood at the end of fields, dues, storage, milling, and baking, not at the end of a casual choice. A summer table showed fresh herbs or milk where access allowed, but the loaf belonged to a slower system that began before the season's greenery was useful. Grain had to survive handling, division, damp, pests, and delay before it became meal or bread, and each step shaped how confidently a household ate. Storage also changed time. Cereal food did not arrive only when the field was ripe. It was held, guarded, and drawn down across months. That made bread more stable than the smaller foods that brightened summer dishes. The barn and store did not make every family secure, but they explain why bread carried such authority in late medieval diets. It was the ordinary form in which managed grain became lasting food. Around it, summer additions found their place. In the households that had them, they improved a bowl or accompanied a loaf, yet they did not carry the same burden of keeping bodies fed through an uncertain agricultural year. That burden remained with grain and with the systems that preserved it. That system produced practical differences before any dish was seasoned. Household size, landholding, and local standing shaped how much bread and ale a family could secure, because access to cereal was never simply the same from door to door. A larger holding, a better right, or a firmer place within local obligations left more grain available for baking and brewing. A weaker position narrowed the same choices and made the pot do more work with less. Bread and ale drew on cereals, while peas and beans belonged to the pulse side of the field crop mix, so the balance between them mattered. Pulses thickened pottage and added substance when grain had to stretch, but they did not erase the difference between households with fuller cereal access and households living closer to the edge of supply. This was not a neat division between comfort and hunger. It was a set of gradations in which the same foods carried different pressures. One family kept bread and ale more steadily in reach, while another leaned harder on beans, peas, greens, and whatever dairy was available. Summer made such differences more workable, since gardens and animals added options, yet it did not make them disappear. The practical consequence was a table shaped by means. Grain remained the measure of ordinary provision, and pulses showed how the field crop mix helped households manage the unequal share of that provision without turning difference into one visible menu or one village rule for everyone alike in summer eating. Ale needs its own place in this summer grain world because it was common without becoming a clock. It belonged among ordinary provisions, but that does not mean every household followed one drink and meal sequence through the season. Brewing, sharing, and consuming ale fitted local practice, household supply, labor needs, and custom. The cup could stand near bread and pottage, since all three rested on cereal, yet nearness is not the same as a fixed order. Ale appears especially clearly in work arrangements and customary meals, where drink was supplied for a defined occasion rather than for the quiet run of home use. In those settings, ale was part of attendance, labor, or obligation. It marked a social act as much as a private refreshment. That matters because the summer field was busy, and food and drink often followed the business being done. A labor demand gathered people differently from a household meal, and provision for such a gathering had its own rules. Ale was therefore both ordinary and situational. It did not need ceremony to be common, and it did not need a universal timetable to belong beside food. The built world of grain had barns and stores. The social world of grain had occasions when drink was laid out. Between those two, summer ale stayed close to bread without turning the whole season into a repeated pattern. Its importance lay in use, not in sequence, and that gave it room locally too. That looseness was part of practice. When customary eating grew fuller, it revealed rank, duty, and gathering rather than a permanent summer table. Work and customary meals could include ale, meat, or milk dishes, and those additions showed how provision expanded when people were fed under obligation. A plainer household meal and a meal attached to labor did not carry the same meaning. The second belonged to a setting where attendance, service, or tenancy shaped what was provided. Meat, in such a context, marked a stronger outlay than the everyday bowl. Milk dishes brought dairy into a more public arrangement. Ale helped bind the food to the occasion. None of these foods needs to be treated as rare marvels, but their appearance in customary provision gives them a social weight beyond simple appetite. The household was not the only frame in which peasants ate. Obligations could draw food outward, from private store to shared setting, and that movement changed the role of the same ingredients. A dish based on milk had one meaning when it enriched domestic fare, and another when it stood among foods supplied for workers or dependents. Ale likewise moved between home use and formal provision. This social consequence keeps summer from looking either bare or festive. The season held ordinary cereal dependence, but it also had moments when duty made the table broader. Such moments mattered because they showed who had to provide, who was gathered, and how food marked relation as well as sustenance within the local rural order itself. At this point in the season, grain has returned to the center without cancelling the smaller foods around it. Summer grain foods belong to a varied cereal economy, not to a single menu. Bread, pottage, and ale were related forms of cereal provision, yet each form carried a different practical use. One could be sliced or shared, one stretched in the pot, one drunk where brewing and supply allowed. Peas and beans added another field-grown support, while herbs and milk altered dishes by flavor, texture, and richness. The result was variety inside dependence. That variety was real, but it was not the kind that turns every household into a place of easy choice. Storage, dues, landholding, animals, gardens, and custom all pressed on the same table. One food signaled ordinary continuity, another local capacity, another obligation, another attempt to make limited grain go further. This is why summer's abundance stayed modest in practice across rural life. The season widened use rather than breaking the structure beneath it. Its food world was neither blank subsistence nor a festival of fresh produce. It was a working arrangement, built from cereals first and adjusted by pulses, dairy, herbs, and social circumstance. As summer slowly settles, the countryside remains patterned by access and obligation. The garden and dairy have done their work, but the larger rhythm still rests on fields that must feed households beyond one bright season. That weight follows the season onward, even when other foods briefly catch the human eye. Summer milk and garden herbs settle into a careful picture when the countryside is kept distinct from the town. Rural people generally met meat and sea fish less often than urban households, so town abundance belongs here as contrast, not as a rule for peasant summer food. The season opened possibilities, but it opened them unevenly. Region mattered, because damp grazing country, light soils, upland margins, and better connected districts did not offer the same choices. Wealth mattered as well, since animals, garden ground, stored grain, and the means to trade were not shared equally. A good growing year widened ordinary fare, a weaker one tightened it before any herb reached the pot. Market access also changed the picture, bringing some households closer to exchange and leaving others more dependent on what their holdings produced. Summer therefore begins not with one cheerful rural menu, but with a set of boundaries around food. Milk belonged where animals and handling allowed it. Garden herbs belonged where a small worked plot could be kept. Ale belonged where cereals, fuel, vessels, and household practice made brewing sensible. These foods brightened plain fare in some places, yet none of them made the season uniform. Their presence rested on practical access, and that access differed from place to place. The warm months widened the food world in patches, leaving the deeper rural order of land, labor, dues, and possession clearly and firmly in place. That is where the broader summer story rests most firmly for now. The concrete feature behind that variation was the mixed rural holding, understood less as a picture of balance than as a bundle of unequal supports. Across England, arable land, animals, garden ground, stored grain, and small-scale exchange combined in different proportions. A holding with better pasture and milk animals stood in one relation to summer food. A holding with stronger garden space stood in another. A holding pressed by dews or short storage stood in another still. Mixed agriculture did not guarantee a full table. It created several possible lines of supply, each one tied to work, ownership, and custom. Dairy thickened a pottage or turned into preserved food where milk was available and handling was possible. Herbs and greens sharpened or softened plain dishes where garden labor and land allowed. Ale remained part of the cereal world, not a separate sign of plenty. These resources belonged to one rural economy, but they did not arrive in equal measure. The built and worked parts of the holding shaped the meal before cooking began. The patch kept under cultivation, the animal kept or missing, the grain saved, owed, or already spent. Summer food came from this arrangement of resources rather than from the season alone. Neighboring households lived under the same calendar and still met different possibilities. That uneven material frame gives summer its real historical texture, not sudden comfort, but the testing of several household supports under warm weather demand. Its order was local before it was seasonal in practice. The practical consequence was a table assembled by reach rather than by recipe. Dairy, garden plants, cereals, pulses, and ale all belonged within rural food practice, but their exact meeting did not become one fixed summer combination. A household with usable milk drew on it fresh or preserved. A household with herbs used them to alter otherwise plain food. A household with grain available beyond other demands brewed, bought, or received ale according to local habit. These elements overlapped in some places, yet they also stood apart. Milk did not automatically meet herbs. Herbs did not automatically meet ale. Ale did not float free from the grain economy that supported it. Broad food groups are therefore clearer than exact menus. The countryside appears most clearly through cereals, legumes, dairy, garden produce, and drink, while the precise bowl placed before any one household remains less securely fixed. Long dietary patterns belonged to years of eating, not to a single bowl in one warm month. That point keeps the season from becoming too tidy. Summer food was not confusion, and it was not abundance by default. It was adjustment within limits. One resource made plain fare richer, another added flavor, another extended grain in liquid form. The pattern is strongest when kept at that scale, not a recipe for peasant summer, but a set of additions governed by animals, plots, stored grain, and household capacity. It also keeps plain fare tied to the means behind it. A different feature of this food world appears when formal provision is separated from ordinary eating. Lordship and custom sometimes brought foods into sharper view, especially when service, dues, rank, or seasonal labor required distribution. Such moments mattered because they show how food marked obligation and status. They do not turn every rural table into a fuller ceremonial spread. The food connected with estate service or higher-standing households belonged to occasions where authority gathered, named, or supplied more than everyday subsistence. In that setting, bread, ale, dairy, meat, or other foods carried meanings beyond nourishment. They signaled what was owed, what was provided, and who stood above whom in the rural order. Formal lists of food duties and elite meals belong to the same pattern. They describe a world of requirement and rank rather than the quiet routine of peasant eating through the warm months. Ordinary summer fare sat closer to repeated work, storage, household means, and local access. The contrast matters socially. A fuller occasion existed in the same countryside as a plainer household meal, but the two did not describe the same level of life. Summer milk and garden herbs belong mainly to that plainer level, where small additions had practical value without becoming grand. Formal provision sharpens the outline of power around food. Everyday eating shows how those pressures settled into ordinary use, restraint, and difference, day after day. This distinction keeps attention close to ordinary food, where power mattered without becoming the daily meal itself. The social consequence was a countryside arranged by access, not merely by season. Summer brought more green growth and more dairy possibility, yet these possibilities passed through tenure, animals, garden space, grain stores, labor demands, and market connection. A poorer household lived through the same warm weeks without having the same food options as a better-placed neighbor. One family economy leaned closer to cereals and pulses, another added more dairy, another had garden plants enough to change flavor more often. These differences did not need a great distance to appear. They sat within a district because households were not equal units. The contrast with towns makes the point clearer without making urban life the model. Town households generally had broader access to meat and marine fish, while rural households more often depended on holdings, obligations, and local exchange. Country diets were therefore not defined only by what they lacked. They had their own structure, built from mixed agriculture and household resources. Some foods were ordinary in one place and occasional in another. Some appeared through duty, some through possession, some through opportunity. Summer made inequality visible in small practical forms: who drew on animals, who kept garden produce in use, who spared grain for drink, and who stayed near the narrow cereal base. The season added variety, but it did not level the countryside or loosen the claims that already shaped food. Access remained the grammar of summer provision. Those small differences gave the season its social shape. By the end of this summer passage, milk and garden herbs have done their work without becoming a universal answer. They have shown how the seasons softened and varied cereal dependence while leaving its deeper structure intact. Rural households used what stood within reach: animals if they had them, gardens if they maintained them, ale where grain and brewing made sense, and smaller additions when circumstance allowed. Seasonal availability changed with region, wealth, harvest quality, and market access, so summer food resists reduction to one single English habit. The stronger conclusion is quieter. Medieval peasant eating in summer was practical, local, and uneven. Dairy and herbs widened it, but land holding, labor, custom, and the success of the growing year still governed it. Formal food duties and higher status occasions reveal another layer of the same world, where food marked service and rank. Ordinary eating stayed lower and plainer, built from broad groups rather than exact combinations. Summer did not produce a fixed dish or a single pastoral abundance. It produced different uses of available resources inside a rural economy that was always unequal. Milk, herbs, and ale remain important because they show adjustment, not escape. They belong to a working countryside where small additions mattered and where every widening of the table still depended on the means that made it possible. The season closes with variety, but also with the underlying discipline of fields, animals, storage, and obligation. That discipline carries the story forward while the summer pattern still holds. Harvest brought a change in scale before it brought any change in taste. The eating attached to reaping, binding, carrying, and threshing belonged to organized labor on the Lord's land, not to the household's ordinary fare across the year. It was employer provisioning, set around the short season when grain demanded concentrated work and when the estate had to keep that work supplied. Bread and ale stood close to the center because they suited both the cereal economy and the physical demands of harvest. Bread turned stored or milled grain into steady food. Ale supplied drink with nourishment, and in many rural settings it belonged to work as plainly as tools and wages. Their prominence also fits the wider dominance of cereals in medieval calories, though harvest supply belonged to one strong example rather than a full map of daily eating. This opening boundary matters. The summer household might still have garden produce, milk, small purchases, or its own brewing according to means and place. Harvest feeding narrowed the view to people gathered under estate obligation for a particular task. It could overlap with ordinary resources, but it did not define them. What appears here is a managed exchange, food issued so labor could continue, grain harvested so the estate could be secured, and human effort held within the disciplined weeks when the year's main crop came in. Its measure was not appetite alone, but the estate's need to maintain pace, attendance, and order until the work was done. The first concrete shape of that provision lay in the foods most often stressed in 13th century harvest accounting. Bread and cheese carried particular weight. They were not decorative foods, and they did not require a story of rural plenty to make sense. Bread gave the meal its cereal body, while cheese offered a durable companion from the dairy economy, compact enough for repeated work feeding and substantial enough to sit beside loaves. Together they made a plain center for a busy season. Workers did not everywhere receive the same portion at harvest time, nor did every manor treat the pair with equal generosity. The point is that an earlier harvest pattern often leaned on foods that were stable, portable, and suited to collective supply. Cutting and carrying grain placed unusual pressure on estate management, and the provisions followed that pressure. They supported labor without turning support into display. A lord's officers could reckon loaves and cheeses as part of the cost of gathering the crop, and workers could receive them as part of the terms of service. That arrangement gave the harvest table a firm practical outline. Grain returned as bread, while preserved milk stood alongside it, and both were drawn into the routine of work. In this setting, plainness was not an accident. It belonged to a system that valued endurance, countable supply, and the keeping of many hands at their tasks. The ration's strength lay in repetition, not in surprise, because repetition made provision easier to control. Manorial tallies add another boundary to the picture, because they counted the estate's outlays and issues rather than everything workers ate. They show what the lordship provided, what it spent, and what it moved from store to field service. Foods carried from home, obtained privately, or eaten outside the employer's arrangement sat beyond that managed frame. Harvest supply, therefore, cannot be stretched into a complete peasant menu. It was one side of a transaction shaped by custom, obligation, acreage, stored resources, and the number of laborers needed for the crop. That also explains why the same season did not look identical from manor to manor. One demesne might list a narrow set of staples, another might place more items into the harvest allowance. Neither can stand for all rural England. Rural society was organized through local lordships, customary duties, and uneven resources, so provisioning carried the mark of place as well as season. The common pressure was the need to bring in grain, but the answer was arranged locally. In one setting, the cost of bread might dominate the reckoning. In another, drink or additional foods might take more space. This unevenness is not a complication to smooth away. It is part of the historical substance of harvest eating, where the same agricultural urgency produced different managed solutions across the countryside. Its shape came from management as much as from hunger. The steward's concern was cost, continuity, and enough food to hold labor in place during the harvest rush. As the Middle Ages went on, harvest provisioning became more varied than the older emphasis alone suggests. Bread and cheese still mattered, but estate allowances might also include ale, fish, and meat. Those additions changed the feel of the working table without changing its purpose. The food remained attached to labor, obligation, and the short interval in which the crop had to be secured. Ale belonged inside that provision as a practical necessity, not as an extra flourish. Fish and meat, when they appeared, pointed to estate resources, local access, custom, and the willingness or need to spend more on harvest workers. They did not turn the season into general abundance. They show that the system widened while still remaining controlled. A fuller allowance in one place did not erase a plainer allowance somewhere else, nor did later diversity cancel the older cereal center. Bread continued to express the weight of grain in the harvest economy, while ale brought drink and sustenance into the same labor frame. Fish and meat added further layers where circumstances allowed. The important consequence is that harvest food remains flexible without becoming vague in form. It was neither one fixed ration nor a free assortment. It was a set of provisions chosen within estate practice, responsive to time, place, and labor demand, and still governed by the practical need to keep work moving. A broader allowance rewarded attendance, steady pace, or customary expectation while still remaining part of careful estate calculation during harvest weeks. The people fed in this way also belonged to a particular labor moment. Harvest workers were not a stand-in for every rural worker or every kind of service. Their food was tied to a crowded season of cutting, carrying, and processing grain, when estates drew many hands together for a short burst of work. Other forms of employment followed different rhythms. Shepherds, for example, belonged to steadier cycles of care, movement, watching, and animal management across the year, so their support offers a separate comparison rather than a harvest rule. That distinction matters socially as much as practically. Provision marked the relationship between the estate and those whose labor it needed. It showed who was being fed, for what task, and under whose authority. A harvest allowance gathered many workers under one system without making their positions equal. Food nourished bodies, but it also expressed dependence, duty, and estate control. Bread, ale, cheese, fish, or meat each gained meaning from the context in which they were issued. The same loaf was ordinary food in one setting and part of organized labor supply in another. Harvest eating, therefore, stood between economy and hierarchy. It kept workers sustained, but it also kept them within the terms of service that ordered the countryside during the most demanding weeks of the agricultural year. Such distinctions prevented one work allowance from swallowing the many other arrangements by which rural people were maintained across the year and across status within the estate world as well. This first view of harvest food closes around a careful frame. It belongs to the Lord's provision for work, to the estate's need for grain, and to the temporary gathering of labor at the busiest point of the agricultural year. Bread and ale give that frame its strongest cereal force. Cheese gives it an older and durable companion. Fish and meat show how the arrangement widened when local practice, resources, or custom allowed. Yet all of these foods remain inside a defined occasion. They do not describe every meal in a cottage, every worker in the countryside, or every manor in England. Their meaning lies in the pressure that brought them together: crop, cost, obligation, and service. Harvest food was plain, substantial, sometimes broader, and still governed by the same practical demand. It kept hands at work while the estate drew the year's grain into control. It also made visible the difference between household sustenance and employer supply. The season did not erase local variety, it placed a formal layer over it for a time. That layer was strong enough to shape memory of harvest as bread, ale, cheese, and occasional additions, but narrow enough to remain tied to labor. From here, the story passes further into the arrangements that made such feeding possible, with the harvest table still grounded in work rather than abundance. Its boundaries give the season weight without turning a work allowance into a complete portrait of rural life or a settled measure of comfort. Manorial food accounts mix work meals with customary meals, so a ration only makes sense when the occasion is known. In the 13th century, harvest feeding leaned strongly toward bread and cheese, a plain pattern that belonged to an earlier phase of provisioning. That older balance should not be confused with the broader harvest fare that appears later in the Middle Ages. The season was still governed by obligation and by the need to keep labor going, not by any desire to display abundance. Bread carried the weight of the day, cheese offered a durable companion, and the two together formed a recognizable center of supply. Harvest food was therefore practical before it was generous. It could be firm, repetitive, and modest, yet still fully fitted to the demands of the field. The important point is not that harvest food lacked variety altogether, but that its earliest shape is clearer and plainer than the richer pattern that came afterward. Once that older center is kept in view, the rest of the season can be understood as growth around a staple core, rather than as a complete change of direction. The older arrangement remained legible even when later generations broadened the range of foods at the height of the year. That plainness also marked a recognizable minimum for harvest labor, so feeding stayed tied to obligation, regularity, and the practical duty of keeping work moving through the busiest weeks of the season across the manor and its dependent households in practice. Within that framework, the lists do not settle into one fixed harvest menu. Rations varied, sometimes sharply, with estate, obligation, and local practice. Bread, ale, pottage, meat, and milk dishes all appear across manorial food accounts, yet they do not usually arrive together as a single complete meal. Each item can stand on its own in a separate entry, tied to a different moment or duty. That is why the broad vocabulary of harvest provision should not be collapsed into one imagined plate. Bread remained central, ale remained central, and pottage remained central, but their companions shifted. Some entries are fuller, some are leaner, and the balance changes with what a manor chose to issue. The result is a practical range rather than a single recipe. A harvest ration could therefore be meager and still normal, or more varied and still ordinary. Meat and milk dishes belong inside that range without becoming the constant shape of it. They appear as part of a working system that kept people fed through the busy season, not as proof of a universal feast. That mixture of steadiness and variation explains why harvest food can sound repetitive in one place and unexpectedly broad in another. Both impressions belong to the same economic world, where the same staples continued to carry most of the load even as other foods came and went. That is why no harvest list can be turned into a settled menu without distorting its purpose for the people involved in it. Meat, when it arrived, was never evenly distributed. Rural access to animal protein depended on season, geography, and supply, so meat in harvest provisioning was never automatic. One manor might be closer to animals fit for slaughter or dairy use, another more exposed to shortage, and another bound by a different rhythm of husbandry. That unevenness helped shape what looked normal on the page. Milk dishes, too, fit into that broader pattern of local possibility, since they belonged to a countryside where animals were part of daily subsistence, but not always available in the same way. Even so, later medieval diversification did not erase the earlier bread and cheese center. The older pattern remained underneath the wider spread of foods, and that continuity matters. It keeps the story from turning into a neat march from plainness to plenty. The harvest season grew more varied in many places, yet the older foundation stayed visible in the background. Bread and cheese still marked the dependable core of ordinary food, while other items broadened the range around them. That layering is historically important because it shows change without replacement. The new diversity added breadth, but it did not abolish the simpler arrangement that had long defined much of rural provision. Harvest food thus held on to its old grammar even as new expressions entered the line. The balance of staples and additions differed from place to place, but the older center remained plainly part of the language of feeding labor. Local comparison helps place that balance without making it universal. A pattern associated with Sedgeford is useful precisely because it is local, not because it can stand for every manor. It sharpens the scale of what a specific community did, while leaving room for neighboring places to differ. That matters in harvest provisioning, where customary dues, estate policy, and household management could produce similar foods in different proportions. One estate might issue more bread, another more ale, another a greater share of dairy food, yet none of those choices settles the whole countryside. Comparison, therefore, works best when it keeps the boundaries of each place intact. It can show how a harvest list fits its own setting, and it can keep us from turning one arrangement into a general law. The value of the Sedgeford parallel is that it confirms the local shape of provision without flattening all manorial feeding into one model. Harvest food was not organized by a single script across England. It adjusted to land, labor, and obligation. A place beside another place can reveal that adjustment more clearly than either can do alone. The comparison is therefore narrow in the best sense. It helps distinguish what belongs to one lordship from what belongs to a wider pattern, and it makes room for the ordinary differences that mattered on the ground. In that way, the local example enlarges the picture while refusing to claim the whole field. It keeps one manor from erasing another, which comparison needs. Cooking vessels belong beside the account entries for another reason. Estate provisions tell what was issued, but they do not describe how households turned those foods into something ready to eat. Pots, pans, and related vessels point to the domestic work that joined grain, dairy, liquids, and occasional meat into meals. That matters because the same issued food could be handled in different household settings and take on different forms. A named item in a manorial tally was not yet a finished table arrangement. The surviving vessels keep attention on preparation as well as supply. They show that harvest food depended on the tools available in kitchens and workspaces and on the practical habit of making simple provisions serve a hungry season. Bread, ale, and pottage could anchor the supply, but vessels show the labor that made those staples useful once they left the estate account book. The social importance of that detail is plain. Harvest eating was not only about what a manor distributed, it was also about the daily handling of food inside domestic space, where a pot or pan shaped what could be cooked together and what had to remain separate. The kinds of vessels in use, therefore, sit naturally alongside the listed foods. They belong to the same food culture, even though they speak in different ways. One names what was provided, the other suggests how provision became practice. Together they make harvest food appear as a working arrangement rather than a simple list of items. Taken together, the pattern is one of sturdy provision rather than fixed abundance. Bread, ale, pottage, meat, and milk dishes all belong to the harvest world, but their presence shifts with occasion, season, geography, and supply. The older bread and cheese center never disappears completely, even when later medieval harvests become more diversified. Local comparison keeps that balance honest, because one lordship's arrangement cannot be made to stand for every manor. Cooking vessels keep it grounded further, since food on the list is not yet food in the pot. What emerges is a season organized around steady feeding, with additions and omissions that answered to local circumstance. The harvest story therefore ends not in a grand feast, but in a durable pattern of practical sustenance. It was enough to keep work going, enough to show variety where conditions allowed it, and plain enough to preserve the older habit of bread and cheese at the center. That mixture gave the season its character. It could broaden without losing its base, and it could remain recognizable even as different foods came forward in different places. Harvest provisioning was thus neither a frozen menu nor a sudden burst of plenty. It was a workable balance, adjusted to the demands of the year and held together by familiar staples. It was a settled answer to the demands of labor, and its plain sufficiency left room for later variation without letting the season lose its older center across the year. It suited the laboring season in practice. Harvest drew grain into the open as food, payment, seed, and reserve, yet the crop did not belong at once to the household table. Grain renders and tithes fixed obligations and production, naming what was owed and gathered before loaves entered daily use. Their world was one of measured shares. not of household eating described loaf by loaf. This structure matters because harvest bread stood inside a larger economy of claim and retention. Cereal had to serve rents, dues, seed corn, brewing, and the bread that kept labor supplied after cutting. The season therefore held plenty in sight, without making plenty equally available. Harvest bread was seasonal provisioning, not a separate everyday cuisine with rules apart from ordinary rural food. It drew meaning from timing, pressure, and storage, because bread made from the new crop fed work, while the remaining grain was divided for longer needs. Ale belonged to the same frame when grain became drink, giving refreshment another link to the harvest store. Nothing in that ordering softened the importance of bread. It sharpened it because the loaf came after claims had already begun. The obligation did not empty the season of meaning. What mattered was not a special harvest flavor, but the way grain passed through duty before it became food. The cut crop carried promise, but it also carried claims. By the time flour reached dough or malt reached brewing, harvest had become a negotiation between production, obligation, and the household need to make the year hold together. The most visible answer to that pressure was storage. In places with enough household or estate resources, barns, granaries, lofts, bins, and other crop-keeping arrangements helped carry grain beyond harvest. A sheaf cut in season was only the beginning of its usefulness. Once gathered under cover and guarded from weather, vermin, damp, and careless handling, it entered a longer calendar. Storage did not create abundance, but it gave abundance a chance to last. Grain waited for threshing, milling, seed, dues, baking, malting, or sale instead of being forced immediately into use. This made the farm building part of the food system rather than a background structure. Its value lay in postponement, division, and control. Where stores were strong, the harvest surge was measured out across weeks and months. Where they were weak, the crop pressed more quickly toward consumption, loss, or surrender. A store also gave estate managers and households a way to separate one purpose from another, keeping seed back from bread grain or reserving barley for drink. The practical consequence was simple but powerful. Harvest lengthened. Bread made after cutting still belonged to the same seasonal pulse, yet the stored crop let that pulse continue beyond the days of heaviest labor. Storage also gave brewing and baking a steadier rhythm, because grain remained available for repeated use rather than one immediate rush. The building held more than grain. It held the possibility that work done in one crowded season fed ordinary need after the fields had been cleared. Inside those stores lay a mixed field economy, even when cereal remained the heavy center. Cereals supplied the dominant share of calories, so wheat, barley, rye, and oats carried the main burden of rural feeding. They supported bread, pottage, brewing, payments, and expectations about what a household survived on. Yet the wider crop world also included pulses. Peas and beans stood within the same agrarian economy as grain, not as luxuries set outside it. Different field crops, wheat, barley, rye, oats, peas, and beans, all sat within one working countryside, each answering to soil, custom, use, and status. Wheat often carried higher prestige where it was grown and retained, while barley moved toward ale or coarser bread. Rye and oats suited harsher ground or different regional habits. Pulses added substance from another plant family, especially in thickened dishes that stretched the value of the field. This mixture did not displace the cereal base. It explains why a crop-heavy diet was repetitive without being entirely uniform. Harvest bread made the grain center visible, but it was surrounded by crops that helped carry the same rural economy. No single crop name can carry that balance alone. The loaf was only the clearest form of a broader plant world. Even a plain grain ration belonged to a landscape of choices made by soil, custom, and obligation. Its place depended on the field as a whole, where cereals dominated energy, and pulses gave additional support within the limits of land, labor, and local practice. The next feature was not another building, but the chain of preparation that stood between crop and table. Grain had to be threshed, cleaned, dried where necessary, ground, kneaded, baked, malted, mashed, or brewed according to its destination. These steps did not turn harvest into one set meal. They show how deeply food was tied to process. Animal and plant foods belong most clearly to broad patterns of eating rather than to one exact order of dishes, so harvest bread and ale sit best within repeated practice. Bread carried grain into the working day, ale carried grain into drink. Pulses entered boiled foods that thickened ordinary fare. The importance lay in dependence on field crops before the Black Death, when crop-heavy diets differed from later, more diversified eating in parts of the medieval world. Variety existed, but it was often variation within cereals and pulses rather than a wide spread of richer additions. Preparation therefore shaped social life quietly. Milling access, baking arrangements, brewing equipment, fuel, and time all affected how the stored crop became usable food. The same grain took different value as seed, malt, meal, or flour, depending on the season's pressure. No single eating order governed that passage. The practical chain itself mattered: field crop, stored measure, processed staple, and repeated sustenance. That was the season's discipline. It made bread and ale ordinary, not minor, because ordinary foods carried the deepest burden. Harvest food rested on that chain, not on a festive menu separated from rural necessity. From that chain came unequal security. Household resources and landholding shaped food security and access to grain foods, including bread quality. A larger holding, steadier customary rights, or closer connection to estate provision gave one household a firmer place within the cereal center. Smaller holdings, heavier obligations, or fewer reserves left another household closer to shortage once rents, seed, and dues had been set aside. Bread quality belonged inside this difference. A finer or steadier loaf reflected grain type, milling, storage, and the ability to retain enough after claims were met. Coarser bread did not place a household outside the grain economy. It marked a different position within it. Ale varied in the same way because barley, malt, vessels, fuel, and brewing space were not evenly available. The staple was shared, but the terms of sharing were uneven. Harvest filled one store with confidence and left another calculated more tightly, even within the same broad rural order. Security was often made from margins: a little more land, a stronger right, a better store, a less punishing burden. This social consequence made bread more than a food category. It was a sign of access to land, reserve, and timing. Daily bread carried those small differences plainly. The season's crop did not erase rank among ordinary people. It made rank visible in the daily form of grain. The common dependence on cereals bound households together, while differences in holding and resource shaped how securely each household turned harvest into bread and drink. As harvest receded, the crop became less a spectacle of cutting and more a set of guarded measures. Some grain had moved outward through obligation, some was reserved for seed, some entered milling and baking, some became malt and ale, and some remained under cover for later use. The season's bread and drink belonged to that change from gathering to keeping. They were familiar foods, but their weight came from the number of rural arrangements gathered into them: land, labor, dues, storage, crop mixture, preparation, and household strength. A loaf carried the cereal center in plain form. Ale, where grain and equipment allowed, carried the same crop into a different daily use. Both remained ordinary staples under the season's pressure instead. They marked the season as a period when grain was newly present and already divided. The quiet close of this movement is therefore a shift in emphasis. Cutting had brought the crop forward. Storing, measuring, and processing made it last. What remained after harvest was not simply food in hand, but food assigned to many futures at once. Bread continued to answer immediate need, while the store kept the year from collapsing too quickly after the laboring peak. The measures became less visible than the cutting, but they mattered just as much to survival. From there, the year narrowed again. The harvest story settles there, with grain no longer dramatic in the field, but still central in the slower work of sustaining households beyond the first rush of provision. Harvest bread and ale stand best at the end of the season as foods tied to work, not as a single countryside recipe. The amount and kind of provision changed from manor to manor, because harvest worker allocations varied with local custom, stored supply, and the immediate way labor was being organized. One estate might feed its crews from a stronger base of grain, dairy, ale, or other stores, while another kept the offering plainer. The same words, bread and ale, therefore covered more than one arrangement. They could name a modest allowance, a sturdier working meal, or a customary issue shaped by obligation. Rural people also lived with fewer regular chances at meat and marine fish than townspeople, so urban abundance only gives a comparison, not a pattern for the fields. The port, market, and richer table belonged to a different setting. In the harvest countryside, cereal remained the heavy center, and ale turned grain into drink when equipment and supply allowed. This was not a feast placed on top of daily life. It was provision made for a demanding interval when hands had to keep working while the crop was brought under control. Its variety lay in management, season, and local capacity, not in free choice. The bread and drink of harvest belonged to the same world as dues, labor service, storage, and measured obligation, and their shape changed with those conditions. That seasonal purpose kept provision practical, bounded, and closely tied to the estate's available stores. The clearest built sign of this arrangement was not the table, but the manorial store. Granaries, barns, malt rooms, bakehouses, brewhouses, and dairying spaces did not all appear in the same form everywhere, yet they show how harvest food passed through managed places before it reached workers. Grain had to be held, counted, milled, baked, or malted. Cheese came from another line of work, dependent on animals, milk, salt, vessels, and keeping conditions. Ale required malt, water, heat, tubs, and time. These were ordinary processes, but they made the harvest allowance a product of estate organization rather than a loose handful from the field edge. The building mattered because it gathered scattered labor into usable food. A crop could stand in shocks or lie in storage, but it did not become bread without milling and baking, and it did not become ale without brewing. Food list texts describe obligations and elite events rather than ordinary peasant harvest meals, so their grander entries belong to another social register. They still help place the contrast. Formal foods marked rank, gift, service, and ceremony, while harvest provisions answered the pressure of work. The same ingredient could carry different meanings in different rooms. Wheat or barley in an account, a lordly haul, and a worker allowance did not become the same meal simply because the name matched. Harvest food moved through structures of control before it moved into use. Each stage depended on labor, fuel, equipment, timing, and the authority directing their use. The practical result was a narrow but important kind of flexibility. In the 13th century, bread and cheese appear with particular force in harvest provision, giving an older picture of sturdy cereal and dairy support. Later accounts show a broader spread in some places, so the contrast is not between starvation and plenty, but between a more limited emphasis and a more diversified working provision. Bread did not lose its place. It remained the reliable bearer of grain, easy to divide, carry, and account for. Cheese offered density and keeping power, especially where dairy resources were close enough to be drawn into the harvest season. Ale added liquid nourishment and made grain useful in another form. When other foods entered the allowance, they widened the working range without remaking rural life into abundance. The change was practical. More kinds of food could support longer or heavier labor when circumstances allowed. A harvest crew needed strength across a compressed season, and the manor needed the crop secured before loss, spoilage, or delay could undo the year's work. A slightly wider provision could help sustain pace, but it did not free workers from dependence on local stores and estate decisions. The older bread and cheese emphasis and the later diversified provision therefore belong to one changing history. They show harvest feeding as a managed response to pressure. Wider provisions still depended on local means, with cereal still central and other foods added according to custom, resources, and the demands placed on labor. Another feature of harvest food lay outside the buildings in the difference between occasional provision and ordinary household eating. A ration issued for work did not describe what people ate across the whole year. Harvest provisioning must not be generalized into a permanent household menu because it was made for a short season with particular demands. The foods carried the marks of labor timing, estate authority, and concentrated need. Once the cutting, binding, carting, threshing preparation, baking, and brewing pressures eased, households returned to the slower problem of making stores last. Broad access patterns can be described for rural diets, yet no exact harvest plate follows from them. People did not eat as averages. They ate according to holding, wage, custom, household size, dairy access, garden produce, purchased goods, preserved stores, and the generosity or tightness of a given provisioning moment. The harvest allowance sits inside that wider landscape, but it cannot stand for the whole of it. A worker might receive bread, ale, cheese, or another portion as part of estate labor, while the same household's ordinary meals were shaped by reserves and obligations beyond the field. This distinction keeps the harvest table from becoming folklore. It was neither a universal peasant supper nor a decorative festival spread. It was a temporary supply system, one part of rural food life, important because it met the season's most urgent labor demand, and limited because it ended with that demand. Its limits were seasonal, local, and administrative as well. The social weight of bread and ale came from the way provision made labor visible as a shared obligation. Food was not only fuel, it marked who organized the work, who controlled stores, and who was expected to keep the harvest moving. The Lord's officers, customary tenants, hired hands, and household workers did not stand equally within that system, yet the meal linked them through the same seasonal pressure. After the Black Death, harvest diets became more diversified in some surviving manorial accounts, and that widening belonged to a countryside changed by population loss, labor bargaining, and altered expectations. Some manors had to make work more attractive or more sustainable. Others held closer to older patterns. The result was uneven but socially meaningful. A broader allowance could signal that harvest labor had become harder to command on earlier terms. It could also show a manor using food to steady work when hands were fewer or more mobile. Ale was especially suited to this public character because it belonged to shared provisioning as much as thirst. It did not make the season comfortable, and it did not erase rank. It gave the work a communal shape, with the estate acknowledging that labor required support at the very moment when its own crop depended on that labor. Bread carried the grain center, ale carried the managed surplus into drink. Together they made the harvest meal a social arrangement as well as a nutritional one, changing where rural society itself had changed. By the time the harvest story settles, bread and ale have become a useful boundary rather than a final recipe. No universal harvest ration can be inferred for all manors or all years. Local weather, crop yield, estate custom, wages, labor shortage, brewing capacity, dairying, milling, and storage all affected what could be supplied. Even within one region, the pattern could tighten or widen from one season to the next. The safest conclusion is also the plainest. Harvest food belonged to harvest conditions. It was shaped by the concentration of labor and by the manner's ability to answer that labor with provisions. It carried older habits, such as cereal and dairy support, while also allowing later variation where circumstances made that possible. Its importance does not lie in imagining a perfect rural meal. It lies in seeing how ordinary foods became tools of survival, management, and obligation during the busiest weeks of the agricultural year. When the crop was gathered and the immediate demand passed, the special arrangement lost its reason to continue. Bread still mattered, ale still mattered, but the harvest form of them faded back into the wider economy of stores, dues, household resources, and measured use. The season leaves no single platter behind. It leaves a pattern of adaptation, grain turned into food and drink, labor sustained just long enough, and rural communities moving from the press of gathering toward the slower discipline of keeping. The remaining household stores then faced winter's longer, quieter test. Harvest did not end dependence on grain. It changed the pressure placed upon it. Bread remained central because cereal growing, threshing, milling, and storage formed the main structure of rural food supply. Yet the same loaf did not mean the same security in every household. Access to stored grain varied with land, rents, dues, and the strength of a holding after the harvest had passed. A family with steadier rights in grain had more room to measure winter by use rather than alarm. A smaller or weaker holding faced the same season with less reserve and less freedom to delay want. This mattered beyond bread itself. Household resources and land holdings shaped how securely grain, dairy, garden produce, and livestock foods could be drawn into the colder months. The late medieval countryside was not simply an older crop-heavy diet continuing unchanged. Broader patterns had shifted unevenly, so seasonal eating carried both old cereal dependence and local differences in other foods. Winter therefore begins here as a question of access, not as a single peasant menu. Grain gave the season its base, but security depended on how much of the year's work could still be called upon. In that plain fact, bread becomes more than a staple. It marks the relationship between labor already spent, stores already divided, and the unequal capacity to keep eating from what the fields had yielded. The physical world behind winter eating was organized around retention. Grain had to be held, protected, measured, and released over time, while manure management and crop storage shaped the wider conditions in which households provisioned themselves. Barns, granaries, and household stores belonged to a practical order of keeping rather than display. Their importance lay in duration. A harvest gathered in one season had to answer needs long after the fieldwork ended, and that made storage itself part of food. The stored crop was not merely waiting, it was being rationed by custom, obligation, household judgment, and circumstance. Some plant foods fitted this system better than others. Cereals and pulses could enter durable winter provision more readily than tender garden produce, whose place was more dependent on form, timing, and preservation. This gave the winter table a firm but narrow architecture. The foods most able to survive storage carried greater weight, while foods less suited to keeping appeared less steadily. Such arrangements did not require elaborate cuisine to matter. They gave everyday meals their boundaries before cooking began. Bread stood at the center because grain was both grown in quantity and made keepable. Pulses could strengthen the same pattern. Other produce belonged to winter more unevenly. The important point is practical. Storage did not simply preserve food, it sorted the rural diet by what could endure, what could be spared, and what each household was entitled or able to hold. Cheese entered that stored world through a different route. Where dairy was available, cheese could become a durable food, carrying some of the value of milk into a firmer and longer keeping form. Its usefulness rested not on freshness, but on transformation. Milk that would otherwise belong to a shorter moment could be worked into something better suited to distance, delay, and winter provision. Even so, dairy access was not a general rural right. Butter and curds depended on household livestock resources and participation in mixed agriculture. Animals, pasture, fodder, labor, and farm balance all stood behind them before they reached any table. A holding with cows, sheep, or goats in workable relation to land had possibilities that a grain-dependent household did not share in the same way. Cheese, therefore, widened winter food only where the household or local economy could support it. It did not overturn the cereal base. It joined that base as another stored strength, one made possible by animals and by the skill of preserving milk in a useful form. Butter and curds belonged to a more immediate dairy economy, tied more closely to access and production. Cheese could travel farther through time. This distinction gives winter dairy its proper scale. It was valuable, sometimes deeply so, but never universal. Its presence marked the meeting of animals, land-holding, and preservation rather than a simple abundance of milk. Dairy also carried meanings that were not only practical. Medical and cultural writing treated milk and cheese differently across contexts, and medieval habits of thought did not collapse them into one simple category. Fresh milk, curds, butter, and cheese each occupied a different place in the language of food, body, keeping, and household use. Cheese could be understood as a changed food, firmer and more durable, while milk retained a more immediate character. Such distinctions did not float above ordinary provision. They influenced how foods were valued, sorted, and fitted into daily life when resources allowed them. In winter, the practical force of those distinctions became sharper. A food that kept could support a household differently from one tied to freshness. A dairy product made for storage belonged beside grain in one way. A fresh product belonged to the rhythms of animals and local access in another. This is why cheese can be treated as a serious winter support without making all dairy foods perform the same work. It was part of a wider order in which foods were judged by endurance, nourishment, household means, and accepted use. The season did not erase cultural distinctions. It made their practical edges clearer. Winter dairy was therefore plural. Some of it was stored, some immediate, some dependent on mixed farming, and some shaped by ideas about what particular foods were thought to do within the body and the household. Animal foods sharpened the same social differences. Bones from rural and urban settlements point to contrasts in how livestock products moved through different communities, yet they do not turn winter eating into a fixed list of household meals. A town depended more heavily on exchange, supply, and organized distribution beyond the household itself. A village stood closer to fields, animals, and fodder, but closeness did not mean equal use. Some rural households had animals, rights, or enough resources to bring dairy or meat within reach. Others stood nearer to cereal dependence and narrower forms of provision. Livestock foods could therefore signal security as clearly as they supplied nourishment. They reflected who had animals, who had access to animals, and who could spare or preserve animal products when the season tightened. The difference between rural and urban life matters because winter food was shaped by setting as well as by storage. Animal products did not simply appear because winter required them. They depended on ownership, management, market connection, and the uneven economy of slaughter, milk, fodder, and preservation. Nor did they replace bread. They added another layer to an already unequal food system. In one place, animal foods broadened the diet. In another, they remained restricted, occasional, or mediated through purchase and obligation. Winter provision was therefore local, social, and practical at once, arranged around the resources that survived into the cold months and the rights that allowed people to use them. By this point in the season, the stored table can be seen as the year compressed into what remained usable. Grain supplied the strongest continuity because bread rested on a cereal economy built around production and keeping. Cheese offered another kind of stored strength where dairy resources existed. Butter and curds depended more directly on livestock and mixed farming. Garden produce and livestock foods widened the pattern only according to land, access, and local circumstance. The late medieval diet therefore carried change without losing its older center. It was not identical to earlier crop-heavy habits, yet winter exposed uneven change rather than a clean transformation. Some households held several supports at once. Others relied on a narrower base, with bread bearing much of the burden. The important movement is from harvest abundance to stored measure. What had seemed broad in the working season became selective in the cold one. Foods that endured gained authority. Foods tied to freshness or fragile access became less dependable. Land holding, storage, animals, and household standing all met in that narrowing. Winter's salted stores were not a dramatic break from the farming year, but a stricter version of it. They showed which parts of the year could be preserved, which could be claimed, and which could not be counted on with the same confidence. From there, the season turns toward the daily work of making those retained foods serve ordinary hunger, one careful portion after another. These differences continued inside the same village and through the same winter. One holding might combine grain with cheese or other livestock foods, while another depended more narrowly on bread and pulses. Garden produce could widen meals where land and keeping allowed, but it could not carry the season with the durability of grain. The practical order remained simple in outline and uneven in possession. Food had to last, households had to command it, and every stored portion reflected the land, animals, labor, dues, and rights gathered behind it. After the narrowing of stores, the work of winter eating turned toward foods that answered hunger without asking too much from fuel, time, or vessels. The same fuel-saving habit that suited peasant cooking in many seasons made boiled food especially useful when cold months pressed on retained supplies. A pot received grain, pulses, bits of preserved produce, or whatever addition belonged to the household's means, and heat went towards softening them together. This did not make winter fare a special cuisine with its own neat order. The change lay in emphasis rather than invention. Older foundations stayed in service because they matched both the store and the hearth. Peasant equipment supported that plain logic. The tools of daily cooking were better suited to boiling and baking the necessary staples than to preparing elaborate dishes that demanded many stages. Plain boiling made small additions less demanding to use. Winter therefore began, in practice, with a modest alignment between what had lasted and what the kitchen handled economically. Durable foods held their place because they stored where resources allowed, then became something warm and filling. Some thickened the pot, some gave bulk, and some entered only where access and keeping made them available. The table did not announce abundance. It worked by preserving recognizable forms of nourishment, so the season continued on foods that were familiar, filling, and sparing of the fire for ordinary use. Its plainness belonged to ordinary practice, not to failure, and it suited the season's harder arithmetic. The built world behind that food was not grand, but it mattered. Storage had to belong somewhere in the household order, because winter eating depended on grain, pulses, salted foods, and other keepable things remaining usable after the growing season had passed. The important feature was not a picturesque pantry arranged for display. It was the presence of protected space, whatever its local form, where dry goods and preserved foods remained part of the household's command. Grain mattered most where resources allowed enough of it to be held back from immediate use, dues, sale, or shortage. Pulses belonged to the same durable field world, adding another crop type to the store without fixing the exact share they held in winter meals. The crop mix included cereals and pulses, Yet the cold season did not turn that mixture into a precise domestic formula. What mattered was possession and endurance. If a household had more grain, the loaf and the pot drew from a broader base. If its stores were thinner, the same food types did more work with less room for adjustment. Storage therefore shaped winter before cooking began. It held the harvest in a slower form, allowing the hearth to draw from retained supplies rather than from the field. A winter meal was tied to that quiet arrangement, not to a fixed annual sequence, but to the amount and kind of food still under household control. The store gave the kitchen its practical boundary and its daily measure as well. Once those retained foods reached the hearth, their practical consequences were plain. Boiling joined economy with flexibility. Stored ingredients became soft, warm, and shareable inside a single vessel without requiring many separate preparations. This made pottage more than a background food. It was a form that accepted the unevenness of winter supply. Bread gave a firmer companion, still dependent on grain and on the household's ability to keep or obtain meal. Together, they made a meal structure strong enough to repeat, though not identical from house to house. Other supplements entered this structure when access and keeping allowed. Their role was supplemental, adding variety or substance where land, rights, storage, and local practice supported them. They did not displace the durable staples. The practical effect was a winter diet that remained narrow without being entirely single. A fuller store widened the pot for a time. A thinner one stayed closer to the main staples. Both remained within the same broad rural logic. That made the pot a household instrument of adjustment. It brought different durable foods into one preparation, keeping the meal serviceable when one element was weaker and another had to carry more of the weight without changing the meal's broad character. For the people eating through winter, that meant the central question was not variety for its own sake. It was whether each durable food still present would become enough nourishment without wasting fuel, labor, or stored measure before the next measure was taken from the household store. Another feature shaped the winter table as strongly as the store: access to small plots, trees, and household produce beyond the main grain supply. Garden and orchard crops could supplement stored staples where households possessed the means to keep or draw on them. This mattered because peasant food was not built from a single field alone. The same holding that produced grain also gave limited support through beans, peas, roots, fruit, or other keepable produce, depending on local conditions and household rights. Such additions belonged to the margins of the meal, but margins were important in a season of narrowing. They changed the texture of bread and pottage without changing their authority. A little extra from garden or orchard made stored food less severe, while its absence left the main staples to carry more of the burden. This was a different kind of provision from grain. It was less certain as a common winter foundation and more dependent on possession, keeping, and place. The table therefore reflected more than harvest alone. It reflected the shape of the holding, the reach of customary access, and the household's ability to preserve foods that did not last as reliably as dry grain. Winter cooking gathered these differences into ordinary forms. The pot remained familiar, but what entered it marked distinctions within the village. The loaf remained familiar, but what accompanied it showed whether the household's resources extended beyond the main store. In that way, small produce gave social meaning to plain food without turning it into luxury. The social consequence was a winter diet that looked steady in outline and uneven in possession. Familiar staples appeared across many households, yet their strength depended on what each household controlled. The outline was common, the backing was not. Stored grain gave security when it was sufficient, but it did not create one fixed eating sequence for the year. Pulses added another durable base, though their place beside cereals varied with crop, region, and household circumstance. Garden and orchard foods widened the store only for those with access, work provisions, manorial allowances, or supplies given for particular tasks showed familiar food types in motion, but they belonged to arrangements rather than to every meal at home. Ordinary winter eating therefore gathered around recurring foods rather than a daily domestic order laid out dish by dish. That distinction matters because winter pressure did not appear through a completely different menu. It appeared in narrower portions, fewer additions, and less room to absorb loss. A household with fuller stores did not escape the season's plainness, but it met that plainness with more margin. A household with fewer stores depended on the same broad foods under greater pressure, both still cooked within the limits of fuel, vessel, and staple, with little choice. Both relied on recognizable forms. The difference lay in how much support stood behind those forms. Winter made that difference visible, not through ceremony, but through the quiet mathematics of what remained, what endured, and what still had to last. By this point in the cold season, the daily table appears now as an arrangement of durable types rather than a procession of named dishes. Grain, pulses, occasional stored produce, and the forms made from them carried the practical weight because they joined storage with cooking. The household needed no elaborate repertoire for these foods to matter. It needed enough retained substance, enough fuel to soften or bake it, and enough order to make the same broad forms serve again. This is why the season turns quietly on repetition. Repetition did not mean sameness in every house. It meant that the reliable foods kept returning, adjusted by resource, access, and local keeping. The winter pot gathered what the household had authority to use. The loaf held the grain world in a more solid form. Supplements from garden or orchard, where present, altered the meal's edge rather than its center. No fixed calendar of eating follows from this, and no single winter meal represented the whole countryside. The broader pattern is simpler and more useful. The recurring food types carried the season, while daily order remained governed by household means. That leaves the season at the edge of a further question. If winter food worked through storage, fuel economy, and familiar staples, then the pressure fell differently on each household. The same village contained different reserves, different rights, and different margins. The next turn belongs to those differences and to the strain placed on stores when the cold months lengthened. Winter drew the question of food security away from simple seasonality and toward the resources held before the cold months deepened. Land, animals, implements, rights, rents, and dues all shaped the margin available to a rural household. A broader holding retained more grain, drew on more kinds of produce, and met obligations without emptying the store at once. A smaller or poorer holding stood nearer to need because ordinary consumption and required payments pressed against the same reserves. When harvest failed, that narrow space contracted quickly. Hunger became more likely, not because winter alone had changed the table, but because the food meant to carry it had entered storage already reduced. The cold season then prolonged a weakness made earlier in the agricultural year. Spring work, summer growth, harvest cutting, threshing, and keeping all met in the same store. What remained by winter was therefore a measure of accumulated fortune and constraint. Some households could continue customary eating with restraint. Others had to guard the same staples more sharply, knowing that every removed measure shortened the path ahead. The season's pressure was material before it was emotional. It rested in acreage, yield, animals, access to fuel, and the share owed beyond the household. Winter only made those arrangements harder to ignore. That difference existed within one manor as well as between districts, since tenure and obligation were rarely identical. The result is not a ladder of comfort, but a set of margins built before the first severe narrowing of stores. The store itself gave those margins their visible form, though its contents were ordinary. Around 1300, the ordinary rural diet in winter still leaned very heavily on cereals, bread, grain for pottage, malted grain, and other forms made from the year's crop. These foods answered hunger more steadily than anything else because households measured, dried, ground, cooked, brewed, and stretched them across weeks. Yet grain did not stand alone in every household. Bacon, milk, cheese, garden produce, and ale could sit around that center when animals, plots, brewing, and preservation allowed. Their importance came from use rather than abundance. A piece of cured pork, a cheese, a little retained garden produce, or a supply of ale changed the balance of a winter table without turning it into plenty. They gave taste, fat, liquid nourishment, or another source of strength beside the bread and pottage that carried the main burden. The built feature behind this was not a single grand room, but a practical order of keeping. Dry grain protected from damp, animal foods cured or made durable, drink held for use, and small produce saved where possible. The winter household depended on that order because food had to remain edible long after its season of growth had ended. Storage joined the field to the hearth, and the foods that endured governed the shape of daily eating. Such keeping also set a quiet hierarchy among foods, separating early use from what had to be protected for the weeks still ahead. Animal foods deserve their own distinct place in the winter balance because they carried concentrated value. Bacon brought preserved meat into a hard season when fresh slaughter was not treated as an ordinary daily supply. Milk, where animals and season permitted, and cheese, where milk had been turned into a keepable form, gave another kind of nourishment. These foods mattered most when grain had to be guarded, since they supported modest meals, sharpened thin pottage, or marked a small reserve outside the cereal bin. Their value, however, did not overturn the structure of rural eating. Herd size, fodder, milking rhythms, disease, labor, and household need limited what animals could provide. Cheese and cured meat were stores, but stores were finite. Milk was useful, but not detached from the condition of the animals that gave it. For that reason, livestock foods strengthened winter provision without freeing it from cereals. Bread, grain pottage, and ale still formed the dependable base that could be repeated day after day. Animal products worked beside that base, neither ornaments nor substitutes. A household with them had more flexibility and sometimes more endurance. A household without them felt the cereal store carry a greater load. The consequence was practical and social at once. These foods marked access to animals and preserving skill, while their limits kept the grain economy visible at the center of the table. They also made shortage less uniform because a little preserved animal food changed how long other stores were expected to last. Another important practical feature behind winter resilience was the mixed character of peasant agriculture. A holding was seldom only a grain field considered in isolation. It could include strips of arable land, access to common or pasture rights, animals kept for work or produce, garden ground near the dwelling, fruit or vegetable stores, and the labor needed to turn parts of that mixture into durable food. The strength of such a holding lay in combination. Grain still mattered first, but the household with several small sources had more ways to meet pressure when one source weakened. A poor yield of cereal was harder to bear where there was little else around it. It was less immediately devastating where dairy, cured meat, brewed drink, or garden produce gave modest support. None of these elements guaranteed an easy winter. Together, they lengthened the time before want became severe. Resilience was therefore a structure of production and keeping, not a simple appetite or a single food. Several small lines of production gathered through the year and then answered the winter together. The same agricultural neighborhood therefore often contained holdings with similar outward routines but different capacities to endure strain. Work, rights, animals, land, and preservation formed a web of provision. Under cold season pressure, that web showed clearly whether it had many strands or only a few. That difference was not merely personal fortune, it was built into the proportions of land, beasts, tools, and claims surrounding each household before winter fully began. The social consequence widened beyond the individual holding because place changed what winter offered there. Seasonal availability differed between regions, soils, pastoral zones, arable districts, and settlements with stronger or weaker access to exchange. A household close to active markets or usable routes did not face the cold months in the same way as one depending almost entirely on its own stored production. Market contact could bring opportunities to buy, sell, barter, or replace part of what was scarce, though only for those with means to use it. In more enclosed places, the local harvest and the household's own preserving mattered more sharply. A universal winter peasant diet was therefore misleading. Rural people shared broad staples, especially cereals, but their actual winter provisions depended on region, resources, obligations, animals, gardens, and contact with trade. One district kept certain foods moving, while another relied more strictly on what had been saved close by. Rank within the village mattered too, because local availability did not help equally when one household lacked goods or credit. Winter hardship was real, and local scarcity sometimes turned it severe, yet the pattern was not identical from cottage to cottage or parish to parish. The social meaning lay in uneven exposure. A stored loaf, a cheese, a side of cured meat, or a cask of ale had different weight according to what else surrounded it. Thus the season organized differences already present in landholding, exchange, and rural standing, rather than replacing them with one common menu. By the later turn of the cold months, winter food formed an uneven balance of reserves and pressure across the countryside. The countryside did not move through one shared tale of hunger. It moved through many margins, some wider, some painfully narrow, each shaped by what had been grown, kept, owed, exchanged, and consumed. Grain remained the steady measure because it filled the belly most reliably and organized much of rural production. Around it stood the smaller supports that had survived into use: a dairy product, a preserved meat, a garden store, or ale, according to circumstance. Their presence eased the strain. Their absence made the cereal store bear more alone. What mattered by this point was not variety for its own sake, but the ability to keep ordinary eating from breaking under time. A holding with several durable supports entered the late winter season differently from one with little beyond grain. A sharp shortage still dragged both downward, but it struck hardest where reserves and alternatives were already thin. The close of winter, therefore, carried several uneven rural pictures. It showed a landscape of households joined by dependence on stored food and separated by the depth of their stores. This was a quiet distinction, but not a small one, because it governed how long restraint could remain ordinary before becoming true want itself. As the season bent toward its end, the remaining provisions still marked how each household would meet the next demands of work, seed, and waiting. Winter narrowed the rural table before any pot was set down. Compared with towns, country households generally had less meat and less marine fish, so the season opened from a thinner store of animal food. That difference should be kept in scale rather than turned into a scene of shortage everywhere, because place and rank still mattered. Urban plant remains and isotope readings belong to a different setting and do not replace the winter food of the countryside. Food list texts speak mainly about dues, service, or elite occasions, not about ordinary peasant meals. In winter, the most useful comparison is not with a feast table, but with what had already been saved from the year. Bread, grain, dairy, and preserved meat mattered because they endured. A household with better pasture, steadier links to storage, or a more favorable location could keep its meals more even. Another, less secure, felt the season as a sharper narrowing. Winter produced no single peasant menu, but a range of tables set by the ordinary arithmetic of keeping, dividing, and stretching what remained across rural households. Geography, local resources, and access to markets could all tilt that balance between households, so the cold months were also months of sorting, when some places held more and others ran lighter. Market access mattered too, because a nearby town could steady supplies for some households and leave others further exposed to the cold months there. That is the scale at which rural winter eating makes sense. Salted meat, dried pulses, cheese, and grain carried households through the cold months, along with other keepable foods that had been set aside before winter closed in. These stores did not work equally. Fuller barns and fuller larders gave more variety and a longer buffer against delay, frost, or simple bad luck. Thin stores meant plainer eating and less room for misfortune. Status shaped that difference because access to surplus was uneven, and local conditions shaped it too, since pasture, transport, and grain supply all altered what could be held back. Moving grain from field to store, or preserving whatever animal foods were locally available, depended on ordinary arrangements of labor and authority. Even when meat appeared, it was commonly the preserved kind that could survive the season. Even when dairy appeared, it belonged to keeping and management, not fresh abundance. Winter thus made frugality a daily practice. Bread stretched across more meals, cheese was counted, salt, grain, and dairy were used in ways that made one household's reserve last longer than another's. What looked like plain fare on a list of stores carried the whole burden of the season. Winter eating was therefore less a matter of invention than of careful conservation, with the table shaped by what had been secured earlier and by how much each place could still hold. A good store could soften a harsh stretch without erasing it, but a weak one could make every further week feel leaner than it had looked in autumn. A shepherd's provisioning list shows the same practical world in another register. It names bread, bacon, onions, garlic, leeks, and dairy. A sensible bundle for labor and movement, not a polished menu for a winter household. The value of the list lies in its everyday plainness. Bread remains central, while bacon and dairy mark the harder-won animal foods that could make a diet sturdier. The list places several vegetables alongside bread, bacon, and dairy within a work allowance. None of this points to one exact village supper, and it should not be pressed that far. Instead, it shows how food was tied to office, duty, and practical support. The same ingredients could sit inside a household store or inside a work allowance, but the social meaning changed with the setting. A list attached to service says that access was never even when the foods themselves look modest. It also shows that winter eating was structured by rank as well as by season. The issue was not only what existed, but who could draw on it, in what amount, and under what obligation. That is why a plain bundle of bread, bacon, onions, garlic, leeks, and dairy matters here. It keeps the picture grounded in ordinary keeping, while refusing to turn a laborer's provision into a peasant household's exact winter meal. It also keeps the foods in their practical range, durable, ordinary, and shaped by service rather than ceremony. The comparison remains bounded to winter provisioning for occupational labor. Animal bones add another layer, but they too must be read as provision rather than a household transcript. A bone from a kitchen, a yard, or a refuse place shows that an animal passed through a settlement. It does not prove that every household ate from the same carcass or ate it in the same amount. In winter, that distinction matters because one animal could be broken up, shared, traded, or held back in different ways. Protein access varied by status, geography, season, and supply, so no village lived under one fixed ratio of meat to other foods. Better connected households could keep more animal food at hand, while poorer ones saw their share shrink once the saved stores were opened. Even within one settlement, tables were not equal. Some households held a little more cheese or bacon, others relied more heavily on bread and whatever remained in storage. Winter therefore exposed difference instead of erasing it. The cold months pressed everyone toward preservation, but not in the same measure. What the bones support is a broad pattern of provisioning under strain, not a claim that every peasant family ate the same thing. That broader pattern is enough to show how closely winter food tracked rank, place, and available stores. Animal bone material supports broad provisioning patterns, but does not trace a fixed passage through specific households, stores, or shared meals in any settlement. A household's share could rise or fall with local surplus or with what neighbors could spare that winter. Stable isotope readings and urban plant traces belong to another scale again. They can sketch broad habits in crowded places, but they do not reconstruct one exact winter plate in the countryside. A reading compressed over time cannot separate a lean week from a fuller one, and it cannot turn a winter season into a single meal. That is why the safest account stays with the larger lines: more or less animal food, more or less grain, more or less dependence on what had been saved. Those lines shifted with the people, places, and stores involved. They also remind us that winter was not governed by appetite alone. It was bounded by preservation, by what a household could carry over from the year before, and by the reach of the surrounding land. A town can still offer a rough comparison because markets and supply there worked differently, but the countryside lived by another rhythm. Its meals depended on the store, the holding power of salt and grain, and the standing of the household. Some homes kept bread and dairy longer. Others moved through a thinner stretch of ordinary fare. No one reading of winter can flatten that variation into a single plate. The season made the limits visible, and it made the differences between households easier to see. Stable readings may point to broad protein balance across a year, yet winter remains only one part of that larger pattern. That keeps the comparison broad and the winter table open to place. Taken together, winter rural food appears as a narrow arrangement held together by stores, status, and local conditions. Those three forces did not create one universal menu. They set the range within which households could eat, and the range was uneven. A stronger reserve meant more steadiness and a little more variety. A weaker one meant a plainer run of meals and less room for delay. Between those poles lay many small differences shaped by land, rank, and the reach of supply. That is the clearest way to understand the season, not as a fixed dish, but as a corridor of choices guarded by preservation and by the memory of the year before. The foods themselves were ordinary enough: bread, grain, dairy, preserved meat when it was available, and the rest of the stored fare that could still last. Yet in winter, those ordinary things formed the whole structure of eating. They marked who was secure, who was vulnerable, and how far a rural household could carry itself before the next season changed the balance again. Winter did not end the year's food story so much as compress it into its simplest terms, where keeping mattered as much as cooking, and where every saved ingredient had its place. When spring eventually came, the stores would already have done their work, for better or worse, and that fact defines the quiet close of the season. It leaves the year ending in restraint, and restraint itself becomes part of the household's continuance. At year's end, the 4 seasonal stories resolve into one connected rural food cycle. Crop rotation and seasonal sowing kept fieldwork moving from one stretch of land to another, and they also shaped how supplies arrived through the year. That rhythm did not tell every household what remained in the pot when spring was fading, but it did set the terms of what could be gathered, stored, traded, and carried forward. Across the countryside, the 4 seasons were never separate worlds. They were one working cycle, with each task leaning on the one before it. In that sense, The quiet end of the tale is already present in the beginning. The grain, the garden, the animals, and the market all belonged to the same yearly order. What looks like a simple supper in memory was really the end of many linked choices. A peasant table came out of that order, not apart from it, and the calendar kept pressing its shape onto every season. Harvest time made that order more visible, because labor in the fields was often fed through employer provisioning. That feeding belonged to the harvest itself, and it should not be mistaken for the ordinary diet of a household through the rest of the year. In the 13th century, bread and cheese stood close to the center of that workaday provision, while later harvest feeds could become more varied. Even so, the richer spread of a busy reaping season never became a permanent menu. It marked a moment of need, backed by organized supply, when bodies were gathered to the work and kept there. The important point is simple: the same countryside that produced grain also had to sustain the people cutting it, but only in a temporary way. That practical distinction kept harvest plenty from being read as everyday peasant abundance, and it left ordinary household eating to its own slower rhythm. That difference mattered most when the work itself briefly expanded the table. Summer brought a different table, and it was never the same everywhere. Mixed agriculture and household resources created different summer diets across England, so one village might lean more on milk and herbs, while another had a different balance of stored and fresh foods. Seasonal availability shifted with region, wealth, harvest quality, and access to market. A good season could widen the choices, while a poor one narrowed them sharply. Local conditions produced varied arrangements, each built from what land, labor, and trade allowed across the countryside. That is why a summer meal in one place could feel comparatively plain and in another feel almost generous by peasant standards. The variation itself is the point, because it shows how closely eating followed the working landscape. What was on hand in one parish was not guaranteed in the next, and that uncertainty shaped expectations as much as taste. Plenty and restraint remained local outcomes of the same working landscape. Winter closed the circle without flattening it. Protein access varied by status, geography, season, and supply, and that wider pattern matters before any easy picture of cold weather eating takes hold. Salted stores, stored grain, and other preserved foods did not create equal comfort for everyone, yet they kept the year from breaking entirely at the edge of frost. Food list texts are useful here only in a limited sense, because they describe obligations and elite occasions rather than ordinary peasant meals. So the final note is restraint and continuity at once. The season of scarcity was real, but it belonged to a social world that already differed from place to place and from one household to the next. The year does not end in a fixed bowl. It ends in a moving balance of status, storage, and chance, and then the same long rural cycle begins again, carrying the quiet memory of bread, cheese, herbs, ale, and salt into another round for another year.